Hello friends, this is Odds, and today's video will be a comprehensive tier list of every map available in Dead by Daylight as of right now. This is the tier list itself, but on top of doing this, just comparing them to each other, we will also be delving into each of them individually and break down all of the details, all of their features to know their weaknesses, their strengths on both sides, as well as key elements that if you know about them will definitely change the way you play in them for the better. Whether you want to watch the entire thing and absorb all the knowledge, or whether you want to use the timestamps in the description to select specific maps that you want to play better, you will probably walk out of this video knowing something more, and I think it will be worth your time. This tier list and all this information is not just based on my experience as a player with nearly 10,000 hours, it is also based heavily on the public stats that the developers put out every now and then, my own stats of thousands of games played on my stream at a decently high level, as well as the extensive and hundreds of hours of research done by AMGC7, who is a wizard of maps. He is the most knowledgeable person on earth about DBD maps, and this video couldn't have been done without him. So, now that we have this out of the way, some disclaimers before you disagree, please read them. They might help you understand where I'm coming from so that you and I are on the same page. And also, if I ever use certain language that you find confusing, I'm also going to put some definitions on screen right now. Feel free to pause them, read up on them. If you understand all of them perfect, that means you and I will probably understand each other perfectly going into these discussions. And one more thing before anyone gets confused, most of the footage that you'll see in the background for this video was provided by someone that has access to an outdated, modded version of DBD that does not run on the normal servers. So that's where you'll see aerial shots and other little shenanigans that are just not possible to do on the normal version of the game. Some of the other shots I just had to get myself playing against bots. So if you notice the bots in the background, don't mind them. Alright, and starting hot with the number one, arguably most killer favorite map in the entire game, we have Midwich. Now Midwich is a mostly indoor type map that is one of the smallest, if not the smallest map in the entire game, depending how you measure it, and it consists of a courtyard, which is not exactly dense with pallets or safety. This is not where chases last very long, this is where they end or where they start. Not much goes on here. And most of the map is actually comprised of the hallways and the classrooms. The fact that there's no unlimited amount of stairs and halls everywhere makes this map sometimes feel a little bit bigger. You cannot easily go from point A to point B. Sometimes you have to find the limited amount of stairs and halls to switch floors and the limited amount of hallways to go from one point to another. And good survivors that are really good at communicating in indoor maps could find some solace here. This could be an advantage to them. You can pre-run against some killers and have a relatively easy time making lots of distance before they catch up. There's also a few other advantages that survivors might enjoy. The map starts out filled with lots and lots of pallets. You will find them almost anywhere you go. There's actually quite a few of them, one of the highest pallet counts in the game. The totems are also typically easy to find since there's at least one recurring totem that happens almost every time and they affect different floors. So obviously boons for survivors in this map are fairly strong and definitely should be an idea if you're going here. But that's about it. Not a lot more advantages for survivors. This map has one of the lowest, perhaps the lowest amount of RNG variation. The map itself almost never changes, and the more the killer understands this map and get used to it, the better and better they'll do, the better and better they'll understand it, and the better and better they'll play it to a scary degree. This map is just so good for so many different killer types. The top tier killers that have a lot of mobility such as Blight, Nurse, and Spirit, since they have hallways to chase survivors in and cramped classrooms are very difficult to escape. The stealth killers obviously thrive in indoor maps. Even range killers like Hunters or Trickster always find lockers to reload in, which is super handful, and sometimes find themselves in situations where they can easily guarantee hits in hallways and other classrooms since there's so little room to dodge. And there's also several killers that are otherwise not very strong in terms of chase power, like Dredge or Pig, that actually excel tremendously in this map because most of the pallets even though they can be safe, they're also pretty cornered. So a pig ambush or a doctor shock or a dredge remnant play, all of these things are super, super lethal. And even good survivors will find themselves going down to below average killers just because their powers are so easy to use here. There are many, many other quirks to go off, but the thing you need to understand is even if you don't play one of these quirky killers and you have a normal killer with no mobility, you still have a lot of advantages here. Number one, your common meta perks are super strong in this map. Jolt can hit many gens across different floors. No Way Out and other endgame perks are really difficult on survivors because the exit gates are extremely close, extremely consistent, always on the same side, and very easy to check for the killer. If you have gen kicking perks such as Eruption and the like, and survivors are forced to rotate to other generators, they'll suddenly feel the indoor map syndrome really, really acutely. And this map is perhaps the worst example of the indoor map syndrome. It is very, very difficult to find gens because they are all over the place. Funnily enough, some generators are almost guaranteed to spawn, but not always. So survivors can go into the chemistry room and find a gen there most of the time, but sometimes it will not be there. And there are some generator spawns that are really, really rare, some of which you see only once in a blue moon, which will confuse survivors. In some instances of Midwich, some survivors will be repairing 2 gens at the end because they cannot find the third. And that is even if they are pretty decent survivors. So the indoor syndrome hits survivors really, really hard, and they often struggle to find gens, to find teammates, as well as normal navigation for the map. You also need to keep in mind that even though this map has a lot, and I mean a lot of pallets, many of them are in places that survivors just never get to, or then they never drop. They cannot be easily recycled. They cannot be easily reused. Many pallets are completely worthless, and survivors would just never go there because they would go down immediately after. So even though there are a lot of pallets, half of them easily are very easy to play around. And the ones that are not easy to play around, you get rid of them and they're gone. And you don't have easily recyclable windows and structures that survivors abuse all the time, because there's very, very few bolts. You will find these bolts mostly inside the classrooms. There are 2 classrooms right next to each other on each floor. And then on top, you'll find another 2 classrooms. And then on the other side, opposite side, the exact same thing. Fun little fact, if you have a classroom with a window, you will always have a breakable wall next to it, so that once the killer has broken that breakable wall, the window becomes easier. And if on that floor there is a breakable wall, that means that on the other floor on that side, there will not be. So if you remember, as a killer or as a survivor, that in that floor there was a window and a breakable wall below, that means that above there is none. And the same for the other opposite side. So this is a map that has a lot of these little things that are easy to remember and easy to plan along the way, which always, in my opinion, helps killer more than survivors. Meanwhile, generators, as I said, are very unpredictable, very, very difficult for survivors to get a sense of what is going on, and the perks really, really hurt. And now, for a few other things that you might be interested in. The hooks on this map have been notoriously bad. Despite certain patches, they are still a bit weird. If you find yourself killing one survivor, you might realize that there are very few hooks on the bottom floor of Midwich, which is a bit of a problem for a killer. But if you can play around this problem, there's also a plus side to that, because the hooks are very, very easy to defend. Basement, which switches side on this map, is extremely, extremely difficult for survivors to get in and get out if you are the type of killer that can defend it, such as a hag or worse. So getting into basement early for survivors can be a complete early loss, and you as a killer can always take advantage of that. And on top of that, even non-basement hooks in hallways are tough to defend, since survivors only typically have 1 or 2 ways to come over. This doesn't need to be a plan that you do from the beginning, but something that you improvise. Sometimes having one survivor injured, one survivor down, one survivor on the hook means that the last survivor cannot possibly get to the unhook without going through you and maybe going down. So for the most part, we have a map that is on the small side, that enables a lot of different killers, that enhances some of the most common perks, and that survivors need to play really, really well, and that to this day, most survivors cannot call out for the life of them. In other maps, it's very easy to tell where the north is, where things are. In this map, even coordinated teams oftentimes don't call out things properly, and I think you as a killer will notice it. If you don't like this map as a killer, that is completely fine, but the more and more you play it, I think you'll be more and more likely to appreciate all of the things it does for you. Next up, in the second position, we have the Dead Dog Saloon, a map that is this high on the killer favorite side, mostly due to its size. The map itself is pretty small, and then on top of that, the structures and safety and objectives are, for the most part, close to the center. They're pretty far from the edges, other than the exit edge, obviously. And this is a really good thing for killer. It means that if you're right on the middle of the map, you are never too far from any one gen, any one hook that you might need to defend. The size of this map is really, really helpful, and some killers that have high mobility or can teleport and so on make great use of it. There are a few killers that would be extremely happy to play this map only, and they would do very, very well on average. The map itself is an outdoor type map. We have a main building, which is the main element of it, with a shack next to it. This shack is unique in the game in that it has a breakable wall, which most other or no other shack has right now. If you break it as a killer, you now make it a little bit weaker. And then along the road, you also find different structures that, even though they change from time to time, for the most part, on average, are pretty consistent in strength. And they also don't flip or switch directions in any unpredictable way. Almost all of the elements of this map are fixed, including the gallows that spawn next to the shack, as well as the windmill that is on the opposite corner from the main building. Behind gallows, you also find a space that is pretty barren, that has a few filler pallets, but this can be quite dangerous. We begin to get to the trouble of this map, and that is the fact that it can have areas that once a pallet or two is gone, they become really unsafe. This map does have a pretty high pallet count, all things considered, but not nearly as impactful as you might think, because many of these pallets are very weak, very difficult to play. There are only a handful of strong pallets in the map, and once they are gone, it's maybe a bloodbath if you don't get out of that area quickly enough. The best thing survivors can do is run to main building when they are in need and hope that you don't chase them there, or that if you chase them there, better yet, they just keep you there for a long time. The main building itself has a couple windows that are quite strong that can be easily recycled by survivors. If you break the wrong breakable walls, new paths and routes can be opened that make looping even easier for survivors. But if you break the correct ones, then it does make the map a little bit more playable. The main building is not quite as strong, but it can still be a huge time waster. This main building is the main deciding factor on whether or not this map is going to be decent or very good for you as a killer. If you play a character and you know the map well enough to play around this building really well, you will be fearsome here. Or if you can pick your battles and make sure that you stay away from it as much as possible. If you don't, that might be the thing that makes you dislike this map. The main building can also spawn totems, which are strong because they hit multiple floors and are hard to get to. Recurring totems are often also found on the windmill side, which means that survivors can set up totems relatively easily. Unlike the other map that we just covered, the gens in this map are pretty easy to find. Some of them, like main building and gallows, are guaranteed, so survivors will find them relatively easily. There's only 1 or 2 spots that sometimes confuse survivors and they don't find them right away. But for the most part, the map is a lot easier for survivors to play. They just have a lot less to do with than many of the other maps that we'll cover. So you as a killer will often find yourself with 3 generators next to main building, gallows, or around that are super easy to defend, even with the most basic perks. The hooks are also incredible in this map. They spawn very often near the middle, which means that if you have pain resonance, you are almost guaranteed to have a hook right in the middle of all the action that you can constantly use and reuse to trigger pain resonance or other scorch hook perks, which is awesome. Basement in shack is powerful. Basement in main building is decently easy to get. You have a lot of really good stuff going for you, and survivors will often struggle to run you on some of the weaker tiles if they try to do that. So you have a lot of things going on for you as a killer in this map. If you're a little bit lucky, they will not get any of the stronger tiles that can spawn around the houses, and you will have an easy time playing around main building if you have a power that allows you to do that. So when you consider all of that, and you consider the fact that the map itself is so small that the spawns are super predictable, that you as a killer can spawn in and almost always find people and sometimes find them out of spot, out of safety, and immediately begin your chase, you have a lot of things going for you. Now, not every killer will perform as easily in this map as every other, but you have a pretty decent thing for at least most of them. Plenty of lockers for killers that need to teleport to lockers or reload from them. Plenty of grass for setup killers and good basements for setup killers like Hag or Trapper. Easy to see lines of sight for killers that need that, such as Nurse. Easy gaps to shoot through for range killers such as Deathslinger. This map almost has something for almost every killer, and the fact that it has a low RNG, that the map itself doesn't change a lot, means that you can learn it and learn from your mistakes over and over and over as you play it more and more, and eventually know exactly where to chase, where to drop chase, and what to do. You will almost never be surprised by weird or excessive RNG in this map, which is something that is really, really nice, especially when we talk about some of the other maps that are coming. Third on our list, we find Léry's, aka the Treatment Theater, which is going to be a placement that some people will find a bit confusing. This map, after all, has a lot of pallets, many of them pretty safe, and also many windows, and eventually some of those windows do line up with other windows and pallets and make for some interesting setups that good survivors will make pretty damn good. So, if we look past all of that, do we actually have any redeeming quality for killer? Yes we do, and more than that, there's also a lot of inherent weaknesses of this map for the survivors. The first thing that you need to know is that this is a relatively small map, one of the smallest in the game. The exit gates themselves switch places and will never be on the same spot, so don't try to pinpoint them, those things move. But almost anything else, even though it can be confusing, is pretty much fixed. And this is the thing that makes this map really interesting for you as a killer. You can learn where you are, and if you identify the map, know how to find yourself, you will find this so much easier. We start at the big TV room that is surrounded by 9 other rooms. Many of these rooms are fixed and have the same landmarks and the same windows and connections to the TV room. So learning the ins and outs of this room and everything around it is your first step as a killer. It also has a very decent hook and sometimes a very decent basement that is super easy to defend. So again, get acquainted with this. If we go a little bit further into the map, we start to come close to this library side. There is a library with also 4 rooms around it that are not so strong in terms of loops or pallets or anything like that. In fact, they should have no pallets. And then the 2 long rooms which switch places. These long rooms sometimes have a very strong pallet against the edge of the map next to them, and then we have another solitary room with, again, exit gates that move all over the place. If you can capitalize on the fact that this map is small and work with the 3 gens and the gen spread that is often in your favor, you have a massive advantage. Yes, some killers' powers don't work so well here, but that is something you can overcome. And several other killers are actually really incredible. This is a very small and flat map, so Doctor can shock through almost the entire map. A Pyramid Head can tunnel you very quickly out of a cage. An Artist can target every available generator with her birds with no problem. It is very good for indoor for stealth killers that benefit from indoor maps and line of sight blockers. It has quite a few things going for it that make it very tricky for survivors as well to predict you. On top of that, it is the perfect epitome of the indoor map syndrome. Survivors often don't find generators, don't find their teammates, don't get enough information to get actionable plans to follow. And even though the map does have a few hints, like the flashing lights and so on, survivors oftentimes end up 3genning themselves and end up in basements and end up in unfavorable situations just because they cannot get the information that they need. On top of it, almost all of the tiles on this map can be learned from the killer to either get rid of them really quickly or play around them. And they don't translate so well on other maps. So survivors that are really good at running shack, that are really good at running jungle gyms, that are really good at running common structures on other maps will not have any of that here. So with one quick ambush and one bad chase later, you can get your downs really quickly. It's also particularly easy to corral survivors into corners of the map since the corners are very close to you. And yeah, with difficult to find totems, with difficult to find gens, with sometimes difficult to find exegates, you will find more often than not that in this map, survivors defeat themselves. And if you write down your losses and wins, you'll find that this will be probably one of your best maps, almost no matter what killer you play. Fourth spot on our list goes to the RPD East Wing. And some people really dislike the RPD maps. They think there's nothing redeeming about them. You do you, but let me tell you, this map is very different from the West Wing, and it is far, far superior for killer. Me personally, I had a win rate of 93% on this map last time I tried, and if you know what you're doing, you're also going to do really, really well. This map is actually quite broken in some ways, and we're going to get to it. First of all, it is an indoor map. Objectively, it is pretty small, but it can feel a lot bigger because survivors can often force the killer to go around certain hallways or around certain paths. So even though it's a small map, it can sometimes feel a little bit big. It has very little RNG. For the most part, the rooms are exactly the same every single time with only minor variations. Some pallets spawn either in one place or another, and they're almost always there. The pallet count is extremely, extremely consistent, and that's something that you can learn and get acquainted to. Now, if you make the mistake as a killer to spend most of your time on the East Wing of the East Wing, you're in trouble. The East Wing of the East Wing is actually really, really good for survivors. They have this room with a very decent window, sometimes a strong pallet next to it, next to a conference room that also has maybe a decent pallet that connects to a bunch of other things with gens all around. You can then take the stairs up to find the helicopter crashing place, which has decent pallets, decent vaults, decent everything around here. Chases around here for many killers can be quite tough, and they don't necessarily become super difficult for survivors. Some of these pallets are very, very easy to play. You can run a killer that's a bit silly here for a very long time if they don't use their brain. So on this side of the map, it's nothing but advantages for survivors. If they set up a boon, this boon will affect multiple floors, so that's great. Many of the generators are a little bit hard to find. There is a bit of an indoor map syndrome where, yeah, survivors don't find gens, but nowhere near as bad as some of the other ones. Especially when survivors get used to the rooms and learn the layout, they'll be lost a lot less. So this part really wouldn't be too bad for them. Now the problem comes when we talk about the middle, the hall, the middle room, and the west side. The west side on this map is very, very small. And more than that, it has no recyclable windows that you can use several times in chase effectively, and only a few pallets that you can get rid of very, very quickly. Between the main hall and this west side, we have often 3 to 4 gens very, very consistently. Sometimes you will have 2 gens in the main room, which is insanely good for killer, and 1 gen on the inside of the west area, on the library or below, or sometimes 2 gens in there and 1 gen on the main room. Either way, most of the times you will have 3 to 4 generators on a very small part of the map that can all be hit by 1 jolt or be kicked really, really quickly in quick succession, with pallets that run out very quickly in an area where survivors don't always control the chase. Because this area has very close ends, it's very difficult for survivors to run you in circles. You will very, very quickly make them run out of pallets and corral them into hits that turn into downs that sometimes go into basements, and where survivors just never get to leave. And here's the problem. If you as a survivor group see 4 gems in this configuration, what do you do? What do you do? You can't do nothing. The only thing you can do is pray to God that the killer is silly enough to lose track of some of the gens, and you quickly do 1, sometimes 2 out of them in very dangerous areas without using any pallets, somehow, hopefully. And then once you've broken that, then you take the killer to the other side of the map where you can do the gens relatively well. You can take him to the outdoor path that is on the bottom floor, which is troublesome for killer. You have to go around it. It's a lot of time wasted. So if you somehow manage to do 1 if you're lucky, or 2 if you're unlucky gens on that side, then you can bring into play on the other side. This is difficult for even strong coordinated teams, let alone you and the other solo clueless players that you're playing with. Survivors have a hard time, and if the killer has the perks and the willingness to play into this strategy, this map is an absolute slaughterhouse. And not only that, once you've defended those generators, one of the exit gates is also guaranteed to be right in front of you as well. So if you play a little bit into the endgame, it can also go well for you. So tricky to find gens, even though it has a lot of rooms on the east wing, many of them are hard to access and not particularly hard for the killer to get you in sometimes if he needs to chase you for just a little bit of a minute. So it's not a horrible thing if the killer has to go to the actual east wing of the side of the map for just a little bit at the end game. So this map just all revolves around how well the killer can defend that 3-gen or 4-gen even on the main and west side. And considering the meta that we're in right now at the time I record this video, where gen kicking perks and perks like Jolt and so on are common and very strong, I would say this map more often than not will end in disaster. And that's if you're playing a normal killer. If you're playing Nurse, a killer that doesn't even mind the verticality, then it's even worse, because the west side, if you're on the library, you cannot drop anywhere. You will be caught. There's no way to go back and forth. You're going to be pushed into the library. And there's also several spots where the killer can wait and camp and zone out, and you can do nothing. Even if you play correctly and you do everything right, if your teammates go down near hook and the killer sits at certain spots, there's nothing you can do. If you want to go to the library, the killer can sit in one spot and defend the entire, make a chokehold there and defend the entire half of the map, if you will, in a way that makes it very difficult for survivors to accomplish anything. And that's, again, with good comms, let alone with messy communication with uncoordinated teammates. So yeah, that's the face of RPD East. When we get to RPD West, it will be quite different. Also, I have to say, even though the 3-gen strategy is pretty consistent, there are some times where you don't get it and you get many gens on the east side, rarely. And then this map, in those instances, definitely becomes a little bit harder, but nothing unmanageable for sure. At the end of the day, indoor maps are still hard for survivors who are more often than not a little bit more clueless than average. All right, next on our list, we have the Wrecker's Yard, one of the smaller Autohaven maps. Even though the map itself is not particularly tiny, you'll find that most of the safety and structures and gens are close to the middle, with many dead zones around the edges and sometimes even creeping a little bit into the map, which make this map feel and play smaller than it actually is. Now, this map itself has a shack in the middle, which makes it very easy to orient yourself. 2 of the Autohaven vehicles, one of them will always be a broken truck, which is the weaker of all 3 of them. And the other one can be either a crane, which is the middle one, or the bus, which is typically the stronger one. The bus has 2 variations, and one of them has a window in the middle that makes it much stronger. So as you can see, there's already a lot of options. Unlike the previous maps that we've seen up until this point, this map is not fixed at all. It has a lot of randomness to it, and these vehicles and other landmarks can change very dramatically, which can mean that this map can swing for killers and survivors quite heavily. It is one of the first maps where we have a noticeable RNG variation between iterations. On top of the shack, we have, I believe, 6 tiles that can spawn anything. There are not a lot of rules for this map. It does have a rule that prevents it from spawning too many of the same type, but what exactly you get is very much up to luck. And in the Autohaven family of maps, we have very contrasting sets of tiles. You can get a jungle gym, which is really strong with a really nice window on a palette that maybe connects onto some other filler palette, which would be beautiful. Or you can get one of the newer tiles that has one bad window and one pathetic palette. And the game doesn't really make much distinction between these two. So in some variations of this map, you will have very awful killer-sided sets of structures. And in others, you will find decent ones. At its best, this map can be okay for survivors because it's a small map that's easy to navigate. You will never get lost. The shack in the middle sometimes can be a beacon of safety that you always get into, and maybe you can recycle it a little bit. And if you get the good pallets and some good fillers, it can be great. But on a worse day, you'll find that many of the gens in this map are consistently in dead zones with no safety around them, or very little safety around them that after one pallet is gone is completely nothing. So this map can quickly become a very barren map. And also you might get one of the weaker vehicles, or maybe the gens that you need to do are actually in a place where all the pallets are gone, or maybe the tile that you get is a little bit weaker. Even though the shack is always in the middle, which is good, it also means that the killer has a chance to get rid of the pallet in it quickly. And once that is happened, it's not so safe anymore. And now you have a guaranteed basement that is very easy to defend, because the killer will never have to go very far from the middle to find an objective, and they can still defend basement. So basement in a map like this is obviously a big risk. And the shape and openness of the map, even though that means that you find gens fast, yeah, it also means that the killer can control and see and gather information very quickly. If you have someone on the hook and you need to do a bit of a tactical play where maybe you leave someone else on the ground, it is very easy to know what survivors are doing. Sometimes sitting next to a hook allows you to see so much that survivors can do nothing, absolutely nothing to surprise you. And this is something that definitely benefits the killer. So decent line of sight, decent gen lock-in potential, difficult to lose survivors. The only thing that can go wrong here as a killer is that survivors are super smart with which gens they do first, and you get a little bit unlucky, and maybe you're playing one of the killers that struggles with normal pallets and strong tiles. If you're playing one of the killers that doesn't, a killer that can play around loops really well, such as artists that will love the fact that this map is for the most part really flat, you will kick ass, and this will be one of your favorite maps to play in for sure. Coming right up is the game, aka the GDO Meat Plant. This will be a placement that I know some people will also find very surprising, because this map can feel very annoying. Let's just address the elephant in the room. There are a lot of pallets in this map, way more than the average. Consistently, you will find 25 pallets spread across the map, sometimes very close to each other. And we're not talking bad pallets. We're talking sometimes very safe pallets that you definitely have to break as most killers. So yeah, this is very annoying, and it adds on top of some other nuisances that can get under your skin as a killer. Finding a locker on the second floor if you need to reload is very difficult. Navigating the floors can be awkward. For newer players, it's very easy to get lost. If survivors set up a boon, they will benefit from it across floors, and you will have a harder time finding it than normal because the placements are just so tricky. These are all very unpleasant things. But if you bear with them, as a killer, you'll find that survivors have a lot of weaknesses too, and a lot of things that are maybe not so obvious. First things first, this map is on the smaller side, but since we have 2 floors, it does feel a little bit larger. You'll find that on the top floor, it's mostly open stuff, and the gens are relatively easy to see and find for both sides. And from here, we can already find the CCTV room, which has 2 pallets that always spawn here. This CCTV room is connected by a hole to the emblematic bathroom, which has a generator always, and is also next to the only basement that possibly spawns in this map. This basement has 2 pallets next to it, which are also very consistent and some of the safest in the game. If you can somehow get through it and get someone in this basement though, it can be really hard to get out of here. Good luck getting out of here against a trapper and so on, so that is a constant threat for the survivors. And if we go to the opposite side of the map from the bathroom, we'll find that there is a hole that survivors can jump through from the second floor and fall into this little room with a pig corpse. And next to this room is always a freezing room with a dead person and a window. And this part of the map is very consistent, always opposite of the bathroom. Now, on the other 2 corners, we have a little gap that connects a little hole above with a TL-like structure. And on the other, we have a more normal staircase that leads up with some pallet around it and so on. On the second floor, we find both of the exit gates. The exit gates are always opposite from each other, and they switch directions, so they're not always fixed. They switch from north-south to east-west, but they're always opposite of each other. And again, only on the second floor. And now we start to talk about some of the tricky things that survivors have to deal with. The more observant survivors will notice that when they see a sliding gate, that means that there's a generator there. These sliding gates will open as the generators get completed. On the bottom floor, the gens are always on one side of the sliding gates, and on the bottom, they are on the other. So by looking at a gate and knowing which floor you're on, you can immediately tell if a generator is there and where, and whether or not it's completed, because if it's completed, the sliding gate is open. Before the gates are open though, they will just block the way. And this can be really tricky for survivors. They can often find themselves in rooms that are pretty difficult to escape and very easy to feel corralled in. Even if you do have pallets around you, some of these pallets are not as good as they look. And with some easy killer powers or easy course of actions, killers can get very, very quick hits in some areas. And even if the pallets are a bit of a hindrance, getting rid of them, that's it. Doesn't make them spawn again. Unlike other maps that have tons of windows or very strong main buildings that survivors can use and reuse, in this map, for the most part, there are no windows, and certainly no windows that survivors can vault repeatedly forever until the end of time. You will find that they will quickly run out of steam, and if you create a dead zone, or if you play around the pallets well, or if you're the type of killer that ignores pallets, you will have a much easier time playing this than the survivors often will. This map, despite being a little bit open on the second floor, still has much of the indoor map syndrome, where survivors don't find the first gens quickly, don't find the last gens that they need to do quickly. If they get hit by a perk that makes them have to rotate to another gen, they don't know where it is. They don't see their teammates or the killer oftentimes, so they don't react super well to it. If they have a plan to find a chest or a boon, they often don't find it as quickly. So all of these things are really, really good for you. You will find that even if you play this map pretty mindlessly without paying much attention, it's almost inevitable that near the end of the game, all of the gens will be close to you. Because the gens are so well spread and so tight, no matter what you do, you will almost always accidentally end with 3 or 4 gens that are close to you on one side of the map, which is awesome because that will often be where the pallets are gone. If you are particularly good at doing that, then this map becomes a nightmare for survivors. And if you are particularly lucky, there are some variations on this map that happen rarely, where most of the generators are on the bottom floor. So in those situations, you might not even have to deal with the difficulties of dealing with 2 floors. You might just straight up just play on one corner of this map and have several gens close to each other on the same floor. And when this happens, and I've seen some extreme cases, it is pretty nutty for the killer. Now, on top of having an inescapable basement that is really hard to get into, survivors can also get caught in the bathroom. Some killers, if you get caught in the bathroom, that's an instant down or worse, which is pretty good. The exit gates are awkward to get for the killer. Sure, if you end at the end of the game on the bottom floor, you won't be able to immediately defend them, but this is also kind of bad for the survivors, because if they, at the end of the game, get caught on the bottom floor, it is almost impossible for survivors to rescue them and realistically get onto the top floor and then out into the gates, which are pretty far from the action. So when you consider all of these things, you have a map that is difficult to play for both sides, absolutely, but when played correctly, is pretty damn tricky for survivors who, remember, don't have any obvious tale of where things are. It is hard for survivors to communicate which room they're in when they all look roughly the same, and very difficult for them to get an idea of where to go, whereas the killer has their work a little bit easier for them since you actually see the autos of the gens and you don't have that layer of having to wonder what to do. So all of those things considered, this map is hard for both sides, but definitely favors killer a bit more, especially if you bring perks like Corrupt Intervention, which will force survivors to find gens in even harder spots, Jolt, which can hit almost every gen in the map from the middle, which is insane, and other perks that are common like this, which will make it very, very difficult for survivors to get gens done. Not to mention stealth killers getting benefit from being indoors, killers like Doctor having a massive tear radius that envelops the entire map, and many other examples of killers that can do really, really well here, despite the gross and absolutely obscene pallet count. Following up, we arrive at the Shelter Woods, easily the most killer-sided of all the Macmillan maps. Now, the key element to understand about Shelter Woods is that some things change and some things don't, but the ones that change are pretty dramatic. The pallet count on this map can be insane. It can go as low as 8, which is really bad for survivors, or as high as 16, which is really good for a map of this size. This is a map that is pretty large, but you'll find that most of the safety elements and objectives are near the middle. There are many dead zones and the edges are pretty barren, so for the most part you'll be playing around the middle. This map will feel more like a medium-sized map. If you play a high mobility killer, it might even feel like a small map because you can always go from point A to point B almost uninterrupted. There's almost no barriers, and anything you see you can immediately follow because there's so many line of sight opportunities. So that is really, really good for killers, and that of course never changes. On top of having a very simple tree at the middle that does absolutely nothing for gameplay, we have a shack which never changes, fairly isolated, and then a bunch of other structures in a bit of a pentagram shape that never change position. Now these structures themselves also change very dramatically. You could have, there's no rules to them, you could have 5 strong jungle gyms with insane windows and insane pallets and maybe some good fillers in between them, or you could have 4 TLs. There's nothing preventing that. There's no rule that makes them strong or weak. They are completely up to luck. More often than not, you'll get something in the middle. Sometimes this benefits killer, but this map can be very extreme. Just keep that in mind. The gens themselves are pretty spread out, and it can be a daunting task to try to keep track of all of them. Some of the gens will easily get completed. After all, this is an open map, which means that survivors will find each other easily and will find the gens quickly and will group up on them fast. But this also has its downsides. They cannot really do anything around the map without you seeing them if you're patrolling. And for the most part, if they get weaker structures, they'll run out of pallets really quickly and you will probably destroy them. It plays very, very simple. The basement is always in shack. Obviously, there's no other place. And around shack, you'll often find opportunities to gen lock survivors by protecting 3 gens around it. And behind shack, they really don't find a lot of safety. Maybe some filler pallets, maybe not even that. So when you consider that and the fact that this map has no complex structures, no elevation where survivors can be tricky, this can make this map very decent for many killers, while also being potentially a little bit tricky if the map RNG is a bit unfavorable for you and you're one of the slower killers. But that's about all there is to it. Up next, we find the Wretched Shop from the Autohaven family of maps, and this is actually one of the largest maps in the game. It's actually really big, but it doesn't feel like it, because the edges, and sometimes even into the map, are full of dead zones, places with no safety, sometimes even no generators or other objectives, so survivors and killers will probably not actually go around the entire map much, which is probably a good thing, because otherwise it would be quite large. The layout of this map is very simple. We have a main building, which is this little garage. Across from it, we find the shack, which never changes places. Between these two elements, we have a long path that sometimes is filled with little car filler pallets and so on. And we also, around this path, find the 2 landmark vehicles of Autohaven. One of them will always be a broken truck, the weaker of the 3, and the other one can be a crane, which is alright and not too bad, or the bus, which is a little bit stronger, especially if it's the type of bus that has the middle window. So already, as you can see, a lot of variation. There's also 4 maze tiles, almost in a cross shape, evenly split around the map. And there are no rules for these. There can be anything you'd like. And the pallet count is also widely divergent, and it can go pretty extreme both ways. On a very good day, this map will have a main building that has one of the 2 windows that can spawn that is the best one, that can make the main building pretty good. And hopefully the main building will look away from the center, which will make it easier for the survivors to hide in it. It also has a pretty recurrent totem inside that can be pretty good for survivors to set up a boon if they choose to do that. So on a good day, main building can be okay. On a bad day, the main building will face the middle, and then the killer will have a much easier time patrolling it and controlling it and checking it visually at the start. And if they get the other window, then the main building is actually not that good of a loop at all. In fact, it can be a death trap where it's easy to get trapped into or even put into the basement and there's no way to get in safely. So main building can also be a death trap. Around main building can spawn a variety of gens, leading to nasty 3 gens, but very little safety overall on the corner side. So main building can be really nasty. As I said, the other tiles are completely wild. You can get strong jungle gyms and tons of pallets, or no jungle gyms and only filler pallets that are not so good, and weak tiles. So overall, the variability of this map is off the charts. I've seen Shack connect to other things in some mean ways. I've also seen it be not so good at all. The little path in the middle can spawn a lot of good stuff, but also nothing at all. Overall, this map, as I said, on a good day can be really good for survivors, but more often than not, it is a pretty easy to navigate map with lines of sight that are pretty good, with basements that are often strong, with pallets that are often not that many or not that good, and with very unreliable strong tile generation. Survivors have no idea where to find good stuff consistently because there's no consistency to this map. And I think that is the main problem with it, and what makes it a bit of a more or less killer-sided map on average. Understanding, of course, that sometimes it can swing the other way quite dramatically. Coming up, we have the Cold Tower, a smaller map that is not particularly large that many people find pretty balanced or even decent for killer. But as you will soon find out, this map is very volatile, very unpredictable, and while on average it might actually be fairly decent for killer, you need to be afraid of the worst case scenarios for either side. So this map, as we said, is not too big. We have a pretty large main building with 2 floors. The second floor doesn't have a lot of safety to it. It just consists of 1 gen that always spawns there and some drops, which can be useful with balanced landing or just as a general hiding spot or a boon area, since it affects multiple floors. So it's not too bad, but nothing insane. The bottom of the main building will always have 1 vault, which is very, very decent until a certain brickle wall is open, and then it's not so strong, which will also spawn 2 pallets around it. There are 2 configurations, 1 vault, 2 pallets, and then an alternative 1 vault, 2 pallets. Most of them pretty decent pallets, not too bad. This main building is quite okay, especially if it connects to the nearby tiles, but eventually when these pallets and the breakable walls are dealt with, it doesn't become super strong forever. Near this main building, we find a variety of tiles and a path that's completely straight that leads us to the other side of the map. Before we get to the other side, we always have a little obstacle in the middle, which is typically a mountain of logs or a water tower that doesn't have much element of gameplay around it. It's just a little obstacle to go around. And then we reach the shack. The shack can actually be connected fairly well to the rest of the map. On its right side, we'll see oftentimes a very empty and barren space. On a best case scenario, survivors can get hills with favorable locations that allow them to run into them and then into shack and so on. So it can get okay, but for the most part, this right side is pretty empty. The shack itself can be connected to a tile that can spawn on this path called a straight tile. So potentially this shack can be quite troublesome if connected to other stuff. And of course, we have a bunch of tiles, of maze tiles, 5 of them spread on the maps on either side of this path. Now, these tiles don't have a lot of rules. There are some rules to allow extreme repetitions, but there is no rules per se that dictate which strong tiles will spawn or won't spawn. So in a worst case scenario, as a killer, you could get 4 jungle gyms or 4 jungle gyms or the equivalent, really, really strong tiles that would be really, really difficult to deal with, especially considering that they are pretty well connected to each other sometimes, with decent filler pallets sometimes spawning in the middle and nearby. So that could be really, really troublesome. But then on the flip side, you sometimes have configurations of this map where all of the tiles are pretty weak. They're just TLs or pallet gyms that you can easily get rid of and not worry about again. So RNG goes a long, long way in this map in deciding how strong it's going to be for survivors. Now, the size of the map and the very clear callouts make this a really good map for teams that can quickly act on callouts and use teamwork. So you will see tournament survivors do really well in maps like this. But it's also really, really small and compact, so strong killers will have a field day in maps like this where survivors cannot run away forever. They will often get caught before they can make it very far. The main building, as we mentioned, has 1 generator on the second floor always, and almost invariably spawns 1 generator on the right side and on the left side of it. So holding a 3 generator in the main building is almost always a plan that the killer can rely on, with sometimes other generators also being close. So you could be fighting for a 3 or a 4 gen around main building, which is pretty crazy. Not to mention that you also have the possibility of basement and other nasty surprises for them. Then again, it's all going to come down to how lucky survivors get, how interconnected these tiles are, whether or not they get a couple insane windows lined up, and whether or not the exit gates are helpful. Very unpredictable map. Some hills spawning here, some gates spawning here can change absolutely everything. But for the most part, you have a map that is relatively, on average, manageable for killer. Next up, we have the Pale Rose, one of the two swamp maps and probably the more killer-friendly one of the two. That being said, it's a bit of a weird map. Let's just navigate it. This is a large map, but that doesn't feel so big because most of the action happens around the middle and there's not a lot of obstacles in the middle. So you'll find that this map plays out more like a medium one. The main flagship of the map is its main building, the Pale Rose itself. It's a big ship. It has two pallets always. One will always be up top on one of several spots and the other one will always be below on one of several spots, and they don't change too much in strength. So that's nice. Also has a few windows and a chance for a pretty good basement. Then we have another smaller ship, which only has a little vault on the back of it, which can be decent and it's pretty recyclable. Survivors can use it several times and sometimes can connect a little bit with other parts of the map, but it's not a huge deal. Next to it on the corner, we have the only structure tile in the entire map. So you might find a jungle gym or something else here, and that will be the only one of its kind, nothing else. And if we go on the other side of the small ship, we find the shack, which typically has some stuff around it, and it's on its own corner. On the other side, we find the pier, which has two sides to it. It's a little platform with some filler pallets in between, and even some stuff around the edges of the map. These maps are very unique in the fact that they spawn stuff on the edges of the map. And for some killers, this can be very good or very bad, mostly very bad. If you play Plague, for instance, her fountains will spawn on the edges of the map, which is bad because you'll waste a lot of time. If you play Trapper, you'll have your trap spawn on the edges of the map. The hatch itself can spawn on the edges of the map. These maps are really, really weird and hopefully will rework next. But that aside, how good or bad are these maps for you as a killer? Well, there are some things going for you. The main building and the pier and the different hills that can spawn will give you some nice visibility so that you know where to go. The gens can sometimes be not too bad. The map is big, but you will sometimes have a few of them around shack that are easily defended. And you will also find that sometimes some gens spawn on the actual edge of the map, which is a bad thing because those are hard to defend. But from my experience, it is a double-edged sword because many survivor teams don't even realize that those gens exist because they don't see them right away. They just find the other ones. So that is a good and bad kind of thing. The basement, as we explained, is pretty good. Dead zones can spawn almost anywhere between the main landmarks. So you might find that the map is actually fairly open, which for some killers is a really, really good thing. And the one thing you might not like so much is that there's not a lot of consistent lockers. So if you're a killer that requires lockers for the gameplay, you might not enjoy this map so much. But that's about it. All of those things are good for killer, and on average, this map for killer is definitely manageable. But now we get to the ifs and the buts and the RNG. This map can swing to the survivor side very, very quickly and very, very aggressively. We only have one tile that we've explained is the only one in the map, and this tile has no rules. It could be a 4-lane wall, which is not very good, or it could be a jungle gym, which is very strong, and there's nothing that decides that one is the better of the other. There's no rules, so you could get either, which is very, very upsetting when you get the one you don't want. There is also a tendency for the space between around the shack and sometimes the space around the main building to have certain filler tiles that are very decent. We have a pallet that is almost guaranteed to spawn next to shack. And furthermore, the ability to have a certain log with a vault in it that I call the Pog log because it's really, really good. It's a really strong log that has a vault in it that survivors can use many times against certain killers, and it's an amazing, amazing filler material if you have it next to shack or if you have it next to something else. And this map is really strange. Sometimes it will spawn these filler vaults on edges away from everything where survivors will never use them, or they can spawn them right next to the main building and there is no guarantee of what you will get, which is very, very upsetting because the map will change very dramatically depending on where these logs spawn. And there's a few fixed locations for them. And then we get to the pier. The pier is strange. It is very, very strange. It actually has 3 variations. In one of them, the bottom of it will resemble a 4-lane wall. In another one, it will be a bit more like a jungle gym. And in another, it will look more like a TNL wall. So it's like a hybrid of a tile and the actual pier. And these piers are split in different sections that we've color-coded for you. And these typically spawn 1 pallet each. So the piers will have 2 to 3 pallets, sometimes with one of them being on the top of the pier, which is not so good because you can't really loop around it very much and some killers can really push you out of it. And if you fall from the top, unless you have balanced landing, it's not so good. So the top of the pier is not the problematic part. The problematic part is the bottom. On some of these configurations, we have pallets that are really, really weak, But if you get them on another spot, now they're suddenly really, really strong. So you have a map that is already very RNG heavy, that can already swing both ways quite a bit, and then you get pallets that can change locations and in doing so become much, much stronger. Not to mention that the pallet count can go from 8 to 13, which is quite the significant jump. This map is really, really, really tricky. You will play it twice, and once it will feel like an amazing map, and the other it will feel like it was impossible and everything was rigged, because it was. The pier, the connecting tiles around it, everything in between can be so good or so bad for killer that it's actually really, really hard to place this map. It's my estimation that on average, it will be roughly around this level of good for killer. But it might still frustrate you to find that when you play it, you get really, really bad variations where you get all of the bad stuff as a killer. As a survivor, I think it's very important that you understand what to look for and where is the good stuff. If you are lucky, you will notice that a log has spawned next to main, or one of the piers has the good pallet. In that situation, you need to make sure you abuse those things when possible and not waste them otherwise. Coming up, we'll be talking about the Sanctum of Wrath, one of the 2 Yamaoka maps from the Oni. And at first glance, this map should strike you as a very difficult map for killer. It really feels like it should be, at least in paper. It is a very large map with equally large gen spreads. You can have one gen on one corner, then another on another corner, then another on another corner. They can be really, really far away from each other, forcing you to make tremendously large patrols between them. The lockers can be very strange. There's not a lot of them guaranteed to spawn in many areas, and some actual tiles spawn without lockers in this particular family of maps. So if you play Dredge or another map, dependent killer that needs to reload and lockers, that is going to hurt sometimes a lot. The basement in Shack is not very centralized. In fact, the Shack switches places, so you can't even predict that if you don't pay a bit of attention. And the basement in main is not very easy to defend, so the basements are not a strong point of this map. The gates can also be split on one side and the other, or they could be together. If they're split, that could be really, really hard for you as a killer to defend. And there are 4 tiles that spawn, and at least one of them is guaranteed to be pretty damn strong, with the other ones maybe also being strong. Potentially you could have 4 tiles that are all pretty good. So all of this sounds really, really bad for killer. But that's it. From here on out, it gets better. Especially if you can stay away from the Shack, which as we mentioned switches places, and can sometimes be right next to another tile that could totally be really strong. You can get some really, really mean Shack and jungle gym combos. If that doesn't happen, or if you stay away from that, this map gets much, much better. And the main reason why is the main building. The main building not only is bad for survivors, it's actually great for killer. It is this flat pyramid that you can climb up on top and see the entire map, which allows you to gather information really, really quickly and quickly split up the team if they need to get from one point to another, or if they need to find hatch at the end. It's super, super easy to gather information and act on it. This main building has basically no safety. On top of it, there will always be one pallet on one of 2 spots. And on either side, left or right, you will also have one pallet, but only one. So if you see it on the right, it's not going to be on the left. And if you spot it on the left, don't forget about it because it won't be on the right. So 2 pallets around it, they're not even good. The windows, unless you make a mistake, they're not particularly strong around main building. So main building is incredible for the killer and always has a generator, which you can use as part of a 3-gen. Or you can use focus on the 3-gen that is on one of the sides. If you can compartmentalize this map into one half and play into that half very aggressively, the map becomes a lot better, whether you use the main building or not. Even though we did say that there can be some strong tiles, there can also not be many, or not where you need them to not be. And on top of that, the fillers on this map often spawn without pallets. The pallet count is big, sure, 11 to 15, but it's pretty spread out. And as we mentioned, some of those pallets are not that good at all. And sometimes they're just straight up missing. So you can have areas with very little safety where you hook a person and you have multiple gens around it and there's not much they can do about it. So that's great, with always an easy time keeping line of sight and splitting the map in half. So those things are really good for killers and are what ultimately make Sanctum of Wrath a relatively killer-friendly map. That being said, it's still a big map. If you get unlucky with Jack and it lines up a certain way and you get unlucky with the tiles, it's going to be nasty. And you will probably need to look into very quickly making strategical plays of locking down certain gens near the end to keep things afloat. That is very much all there is to it. Remember that whichever spot doesn't have the shack will instead have a little Japanese garden. And these are very inconsistent in terms of the pallets they spawn. So it's very much of a guessing game for survivors. If you are sharp as a killer, this map should be pretty good for you. If you are sharp as a survivor, what you'll need to do is immediately try to break any 3-gen that you can. Make sure that the killer has to go from one side to the other constantly. Never get caught in the main building too easily, and look out for the common perks. Also, if the exit gates are too close to each other on the same side, better notice it early than late and be ready for it near the end game. Good luck. And lo and behold, we've reached the RPD West Wing variation. Now, I highly recommend that you watch the East Wing first to fully understand what's wrong with this one and why it's so much worse. But first, let's talk about the things that are very clear and that are in common with the previous one. This is an indoor map based more or less on the same building that we had in the East Wing, but with different areas available. Now, it's still relatively small in comparison to other maps in terms of square meters, but this map in particular compared to the other one feels way bigger because you will be more often than not as a killer forced to traverse and catch up around certain loops, which will make the map feel bigger. And a similar thing happens obviously to survivors. The map itself still has very low variation. Almost all the windows are exactly the same. The pallets are also almost exactly the same. Most of them have 1 or 2 spots where they move from, but for the most part, on average, they play very much the same every map. So the more important thing is the gens. And the gens in this map are not as easy to hold as in the previous one. Whereas before, you had one side that was very small with many gens concentrated on that side and very close to the middle, which also had a lot of gens. Now you don't have that anymore. The smaller side is the east side, but it's still very big. So unlike the other map, which had a small and a big side, this one has 2 big sides. The east side still has the office of the officer room with the really strong window and potentially a decent pallet, and all of the rooms above it. And if you go to the end of it, you will still have the little helicopter emergency staircase with the path that goes outside back to the main hall. So unlike the previous East Wing version, you cannot chase survivors and corner them easily here because they have a strong window that never goes away, unlike pallets. And you can also not corner them because they can use this escape method to waste your time. And this path often has generators, so they have plenty of reasons to be here. You will have generators on this side of the map that are not easy to defend at all, either by proximity or by ability to corral survivors. So this side, the weaker side, still is very good for survivors. Now, back to the main room, right? We have the typical pallets and windows and so on. And now we have the West Wing, which is much, much larger than before. All of the areas that we covered before that had a couple pallets that you could get rid of are now expanded and are stronger as a result. There are more pallets. There's even another outdoor area that, unlike the East Wing from before, is much larger and actually has one pallet that is fairly good and fairly strong. So you can waste a lot of time here, as well as other pallets here and there that are pretty good and pretty strong. So that's only on the bottom floor. If we take one of the multiple staircases up to the second floor, we have the Star's office, which again is pretty strong and has some really mean boon areas that survivors can use and abuse to set up boons that affect them across the floors. We still have the library, but this time the library has pallets on both sides that are pretty good. And the library is not a dead end. Survivors can go through and around the library in whichever direction they please, which is really good for them. And they still have the showers with a generator there. And there are so many more spots for generators on this side, which in practice means that we do not have a corner where gens are easily locked in. In this map, locking a 3-gen and defending it is much, much harder, and you don't have a consistent strategy to do so. If you go here unprepared, you're very likely to be run around some of these strong rooms with decent pallets that are very easy to play for survivors and pretty predictable to find, which will waste your time a lot. Now, that being said, does this map have any redeeming qualities for you as a killer? It still does. It's still an indoor map. Many of the newer survivors have no idea how to navigate it, thank goodness. And even the more experienced survivors will oftentimes second guess themselves because some of the gen spawns are not consistent and they will not find them. They will waste time going room by room to see which gens have been done, which gens have been started. And if they leave a gen halfway done, maybe their teammates will take forever to find it if there's not a high level coordination in play, which is always good for you. So the indoor map syndrome is still in full force here, or at least in partial full force. So that's good for you as a killer. You have that going for you. The main can still spawn gens, which are easy to defend, and you can still lock the map and try to cut it in half, which for some killers is very, very effective. If you have someone dying on the hook and the other team is on the other side, you can kind of hold them or force them to give you a lot of health states to get through you. So that's still pretty damn good. This map can still be pretty mean. But you don't have that safety that you did before. And going around this whole map feels bad, and defending the gates is tough, and keeping up with boons is tricky, and finding survivors where they spawn is much, much harder in this map. If you commit to one side, you will lose gens on the other. You can't just sit in one spot and defend everything like you could on the East Wing. And that's why, comparatively speaking, this is a much, much tougher map. Just keep the silver lining that survivors often struggle in this map as well, and that some killers can take advantage of its unique indoorness more so than others. Next up, we have Haddonfield, aka Lambkin Lane. And this map, at least in theory, should strike you as a very survivor-sided map. But in practice, it's really not that simple. Let's explore it. This is a big map with very open line of sights if you're not inside one of the many buildings. The middle of it is basically a road with a bunch of cars. Many of them have filler pallets that are pretty safe, not too bad, but also not effective against all killers. The fact that it's so open means that you will often see what you need to do and pick an area to focus on, so the size of the map doesn't feel that large at times. We have on one hand the main building, which has the only basement in the map itself, and a second floor that is a bit of a dead zone, doesn't have much, only one window and one hook. Then next and in front of this main building, we have little parks that sometimes have 1, 2, or 0 pallets, and there's not a lot of consistency to which ones you get. Then, next to the main building and also in front of it, but on the other side, we have the weaker buildings that can spawn here. These are buildings that have 2 floors, potentially, that are not super strong. They can spawn generators as well. Or a building with a House of Pain like basement. This is a basement structure that you see in Badham as well, and it's pretty good. It has some good pallets around it, good pallets inside, and a generator underground, which is a big deal because checking on that generator is really costly, and you don't even hear it that well from outside. So that house is really strong, but it can also not spawn there. There are 2 spots for these buildings, and one of them will be one and the other one will be another, and there's 3 potential buildings, and the third one is an empty house which is just like the basement but completely empty and you cannot go inside it. And obviously this is much better for the killer. So there is a 1 in 3 chance that you'll have this, which benefits the killer, and a 2 in 3 which will have the other 2, which benefit survivors more. Then the other 2 remaining buildings are very similar. They are the blue and the beige house, and they sometimes switch places, but you might not even realize because they play very similar. They are 2-story houses with multiple windows on the bottom, 1 window on the top at least, some pallets on the front and back, some structures on the front and back, and they have some windows on the side that are kind of mean. These windows on the side can be used quite effectively. If you're not super sharp as a killer, you can waste a lot of time here. If played perfectly, these should be really decent in the hands of good survivors. I will tell you though, even good survivors don't know how to run this very well. It's not always immediately obvious, and some killers can play around these windows really well. So at the end of the day, they're not the biggest deal. A bigger deal is the fact that all of these buildings coexist with each other. And if you're unlucky as a killer, you can have gens very far away from each other. Some of them spawn on the little backyards of the houses. So you could have gens on one backyard, on one side of the street, and then gens on the complete opposite end. So you could have very far away gens, which would be far from ideal, and this gens could also be on the underground and on the 2nd floor. So you as a normal killer with no mobility would have the most horrible time even checking, let alone defending these gens for any amount of time. So these gens can be absolutely punishing and brutal, and that would be horrible. But why is this map not horrible for a killer? Well, many times this just doesn't happen. Sometimes you just get the house that doesn't have the basement, and there's no basement gen, and the main building itself has very consistent generators around it, which often lead to very easy 3 gens. The main building on its front will have a generator, and inside will have another generator. Remember, if survivors mess up around here, they could end up on the hook on top of the main or in the basement, which is really difficult to get out of if the killer camps properly. So these are very dangerous areas. And if the survivors don't get them out of the way, a 3 gen around here could be very easy. Sometimes a 3rd gen spawns not far from here at all, near the park. And it can be really difficult for survivors to do these 3 gens. So 3 gens on this map are really strong, potentially, if the killer manages to defend them. Not only that, keep in mind that this map is extremely open in the middle. There is no way to hide your approach if you are camping someone on the hook, or if you're looking for someone at the end of the game that's looking for a gate. If you're trying to just keep an eye on the map, survivors have no way to surprise you. So if you're being camped in the open by hunters holding up a hatchet and your teammates are coming to rescue you, they can do nothing. They will be shot down before they can approach. They will have to go very far away before they can heal safely. They will not be able to quickly sneak up and get you last second. It is very difficult to play around the fact that the survivors have no way to hide themselves around the middle and when they cross paths. So you could find yourself doing a gen, thinking that you're doing amazing, then you finish a gen, then you try to cross to the other side of the street and you realize that the other side is now a 3 gen, your teammates are dying, and everything is going south. Add to that the fact that some of the generators are hard to see. Now, many of the survivors that are newer don't know the totems very well, spend too much time looking for gens, don't know that there's gens on the 2nd floor, think that the gen is done but it's not, or the other way around. Keep in fact that this map has a little bit of the indoor map syndrome, and then you have a map where survivors oftentimes maybe have some chances to actually come back or make a good play, and they just don't, because they don't know any better. And this map, turns out, more often than not, benefits the killer for those reasons. Killers that benefit from line of sight, like Nurse, or that have good mobility, don't mind the size of the map at all, and benefit from all the other things. Killers like Trapper can dish a mean basement and be extremely punishing, while they defend a 3 gen that is almost guaranteed to be around the basement itself. So you have all of these really tricky things where if survivors are not really smart and take advantage of the map really well and take you all over it, they will find themselves in trouble. and that's Haddonfield for you. The fact that it has a building that is super strong, that can spawn or just straight up not spawn is crazy to me. And yeah, 10 pallets, when some of them are not so good, is really not that much. So good luck with that, survivors. Next up, the Suffocation Pit from the Macmillan family of maps. Actually, a very large map that probably doesn't feel like it, because oftentimes you will stick to playing on only one of the sides. It's also very frequent for this map to spawn several dead zones on either side, places with no safety or objectives or sometimes anything at all, so you will definitely not be going on the entire map. Now, this map has a main building, which is a mine that switches directions, and a shack on the other side, and it's pretty much split in half by some edges of the map that bite into the map a little bit. You'll notice that in the diagram, these edges meet near the middle, where the map is a little bit more narrow. This is also where you find a bunch of sandwiched and centipede-like tiles, maze tiles. And these maze tiles have some rules, but they can vary greatly in terms of what you find there. It could be almost anything. Between these group of tiles, you'll also see that we have on either side one of the tall obstacle landmarks of Macmillan, which can be the water tower or the pile of logs and so on. So these are just there as a bit of an obstruction between all the action. So no matter how bad this map is, the middle is densely packed, as you can tell. And even on its worst variations, and trust me, this map has a lot of variation. The maps, look at the pallets can go from 8 to 17. That is insane. Even on its worst, the middle is typically pretty safe. But it's also where the killer will find themselves sitting at to cut the map in half and to try to secure hooks, second stages, people dying on hook, and 3 gens and so on. So even though the middle is safe, it will often be overtaken by the killer, who tries to divide the map in half and make it very difficult for survivors to be together and to coordinate effectively. The middle is a bit of a choke point that can become really dangerous, especially some types of trap-like and prep killers can make it very dangerous. Going through can be tricky for survivors. So that will be a constant struggle from both sides going into this map. And it's one where if the killer plays it right, they can easily come out on top. At its worst, though, the middle can be absolutely insane with really strong tiles into other tiles, with windows that connect to other windows and so on. So on a really bad day, this map could be horrible. There are also a variety of filler pallets on either side of the shack. There are also options for hills to spawn all around here. But in many instances of this map, you'll notice that there's nothing. Quickly identifying which type of Suffocation Pit you've been dealt is probably key here, because you'll notice sometimes as a killer that you have a side with 3 gens and absolutely nothing for survivors, which is incredibly good for you. If we zip over to the main building side, we'll see that a similar thing can happen. You can have decent fillers and decent safety, or almost nothing at all. So identifying which side is better for you to defend and trying to break both sides to force the killer into a long patrol as a survivor is key here. The main building and the shack themselves both have a basement point. The basement themselves are not worth pursuing, but if you already have a 3 gen, then they can be really strong and hard to get out of, main building in particular. The main building has 2 different window configurations that can happen. Both of them are decent, and sometimes depending on how the main building rotates, you could have one of those windows be easily connected to something else around it. So the main building can be relatively good. In a worst case scenario, it could also be facing an awkward location where survivors don't easily access it and get to the safe points right away, which would be bad for them. So again, lots of RNG involved. For the most part, this is a map that plays pretty tactically. It is a fan favorite in tournaments for that reason, but is also really difficult to balance because 8 to 17 pallets, as you can imagine, is absolutely wild. There are some maximum things allowed. The rules are not complete Wild West. You do get a limit of what you can get, but how exactly this lines up is very susceptible to RNG. So again, the middle is going to be very unpredictable. Overall, if you have a solid chase and a solid idea of what is your plan as a killer, this map can benefit you, and more often than not, things will go your way. As a survivor, super important to identify where the gens are, break them, and the killer will have a really hard time, especially if the gates are on opposite ends, where it will be very, very difficult for him to defend them both. Coming up next is the other Yamaoka map, the Family Residence, the one from the Spirit. This is a fairly big map, very elongated and a little bit narrow near the middle, which means that if you stick to only one of the sides as a killer, it might not feel so large, but if survivors force you, as they should, to defend gens and go around the entire map, this will feel quite big. So we have a main building that is just one floor, has some windows that are not particularly strong, some breakable walls that you might not even need to break or want to bother breaking. And on either side of them, we have very similar, almost mirrored setups. We have a tile, a maze tile, that will never repeat itself, by the way. There are 4 maze tiles in this map. They'll never repeat themselves. One of them, at least, is guaranteed to be something decent. And it will be next to a little garden, which sometimes can have decent pallets and sometimes can have almost nothing at all. So you're not really guaranteed anything on the secondary tiles of these maps. You have that on either side, and sometimes a bit of potential to defend 3 gens around this area for the killer, which is pretty good for survivors if they get a little bit lucky. Going away from main building onto the opposite side, in the middle of the map, we find one isolated tile, which for the most part, there are exceptions, for the most part, is not connected to anything great. So that can be quite convenient. And we'll also see 2 of the landmark gazebos around the middle of the map, which are not super strong. This is one of the features of this map. The middle itself is quite weak. Survivors will often try to take you away into main or away into shack or away into other places where they can actually loop you. So the middle, since it's narrow, not particularly safe, and easy and open to see, the killer can be really strong if they somehow manage to create a situation where they can defend this place. Survivors are advised to set up boons, to to retreat back into the area that is safe before they try to go through the middle and perhaps worsen the situation. Then on the corner, we find the shack, one of the worst shacks of the game in terms of connectivity. One of the sides is guaranteed to be a dead zone on the right of it, and the other could have something, but for the most part, this is a shack that you need to play on its own. Take the killer here to waste their time, use it very carefully, because once the pallet is gone, it might not be so strong after all. Basement obviously could also be here. Then we have another tile, which is typically next to a generator by the corner, close to the other gazebo. And again, this is not connected in any crazy way. Sometimes the gazebo on this can be connected in some tricky way. But as I mentioned, these 4 tiles that are spread around the map are guaranteed to all be different. So that's something to keep in mind. If you've seen a jungle gym in one spot, you're not going to find a jungle gym in another one. By elimination, you can kind of figure out what you're going to get. This also means that at the very least, survivors will get one jungle gym or one other structure that is decent, but they could get even more. So RNG does play a little bit of a part here. It will mostly come down to how well you can defend a 3-gen on the main building side or on the shack side, and how you play around the middle. If survivors are extremely smart, they will do the gens in the middle first when they think it's safe. Perhaps they'll get them out of the way. And then they'll strategically do gens on one side of main building and one side of shack, so that the remaining ones are just on the edges. And if you have edge generators on the main building and shack side, it is almost impossible to defend them. And if the gates on top of that are far away, which in this map they can certainly be, your endgame will also be quite tricky. Overall, even though RNG can hit this map a little bit, it goes a little bit both ways, and there's quite a few tactics that you can do on both sides, so it's really all up to you how you play it. Next up, we'll talk about the Thompson House. This might come as a shock to some players that have played DBD for a long time, because this map used to be atrocious for killer, but it's actually now one of the more gentle maps of the Colwyn Farm family of maps for killer. It has one of the lowest pallet counts in the game, only 8 to 10, with not a lot of windows necessarily spawning to make up for it. So it is a very manageable map if you know what you're doing and get a little bit lucky. You'll notice that we have the main building up north, and if we look away from it, we have either a cow tree or a harvester. There's only one. And obviously, it goes without saying that it's much better for the killer if they get the harvester, which is harder to use, and much better for survivors if they get the cow tree, which is easier to use and can maybe loosely connect with some other tiles not too far from it that are never guaranteed to spawn there. A little bit further from main building still, on the corner, we find the shack. This shack can spawn fairly isolated with awkward lining up windows, or it can actually be orientated in a way where the window lines up with some filler pallets next to it, which can be decent. So definitely quite a bit of variability here. And then you'll notice, especially if you look at the diagram, that we have 4 maze tiles, 4 square structures. 2 of them on one side of the main building and 2 of them on the opposite side. And these 2 are connected. On one side, we're going to have one jungle gym, and then the other one will be guaranteed not to be a jungle gym. It will be a weaker one like a TL or a pallet gym. So we'll have one jungle gym on one side and one jungle gym on the other, and it will swap and be random which one it is. Now, it is better for the survivors if they get a jungle gym near the center, because it's easier to get to from different points and easier to recycle and reutilize and constantly use as a threat. Worst case scenario, the jungle gym, instead of being close to the center, spawns further into the edges of the map, and maybe the survivors don't get to use it nearly as much. There is also quite a few filler pallets that can spawn anywhere in between all of these elements. So if you get lucky, you get some of the better ones, and some of them are pretty good. And if you get unlucky, you get some of the weaker ones, or you get none at all, which can totally happen. Around the main building, we'll find a variety of pallet spawns. Only one spawns at a time. You'll get one pallet somewhere around the main building. And the main building itself is nothing incredible. It will always have a generator upstairs, but downstairs we might have one of the 2 basements, and we'll also find a window on the back side, multiple entrances too, a window on the back side, the little back porch, that has a breakable wall next to it. Now, this window is fairly decent, but once the breakable wall is broken, then it becomes really useless, and the killer has time to break it while you take it. So it's a decent one-time use loop, but that's about it. Now, if we go upstairs, we'll find that there's multiple places to jump off from, which can be convenient with balanced landing, and a window that is fairly okay-ish if the killer whiffs at you, but can also be mind game if the killer just waits for you downstairs. So a risky window that can be definitely utilized, especially if you come from the other parts of the second floor, which is very similar. It basically mirrors the bottom floor as well. So very straightforward, nothing incredible about this building. A bit of a time waster, and doing this gen is fairly easy to do if the killer is not too close. So, get it out of the way maybe near the end when the harder ones have already been pushed through. That's it. That's this map. Not a lot of stuff. Depends heavily on what interstitial connecting tissue you get between the tiles and how much you like to play around the corner. Just do be sure that if there's one area that is particularly strong and interconnected, you use it and abuse it as a survivor, and you use it and you try not to deal with it too much as a killer. Remember that pallets here are precious, so any pallet you get out of the way will be one of maybe 8 or 10 that survivors no longer have access to. Act accordingly. Next up, Azarov's Resting Place, a very large map that luckily doesn't feel so large because the edges are pretty empty and often don't have much safety or even objectives, and most of the action happens around the middle or one of the sides anyway. The middle, you'll notice, is very narrow and acts as a bit of a choke point between the 2 halves. Notice that if you look at the diagram, there are 3 tiles, maze tiles, that are right next to each other like a centipede. This is where this map can be a little bit silly, but we'll get to that. And then on both sides, we have a bit of symmetry. On one side, the shack, another tile, and one of the 2 vehicles. And on the other, 2 tiles, which are loosely connected diagonally, the other vehicle, and the main building, which is not at all very complex. It's like a shack that has a breakable wall instead of a pallet, and the window's a little bit stronger, but you can play around it a little bit better because there's no pallet on it. So not very complex at all. Fairly straightforward. The complexity comes from what can happen with the RNG in this map, which is pretty significant. The tiles themselves are limited to only 4 of a type, but that is quite a lot. On the best possible survivor variation of this map, you could have 4 jungle gyms, which would be insane, with maybe 2 other conveniently placed structures spread around the map, with decent fillers, well-placed fillers around shack, maybe well-placed fillers next to main building even. So, or perhaps a hill in one area or another that benefits your ability to navigate the map and hinders the killer. That would be absolutely ideal. And you could also even pair this with a truck. There will always be 1 truck out of the 2 vehicles, and maybe the best bus, which would be ideal for survivors. On the other side, on the worst possible variation for survivors, The 6 tiles could all be very weak. They could be TLs, pallet gyms that you can easily break, the new tiles on Outer Haven that are very weak, that have very weak pallets, or they could be decently strong but not be at the places where you need them. You could get the truck, which is guaranteed, and then the weaker boss, or the crane, which after you break the pallet as a killer is not that big of a deal. Maybe the main building and shack could be facing the most awkward orientations possible with no good fillers conveniently placed nearby. So this map could swing both ways quite hard. On average, it is manageable, with sometimes the middle being particularly strong, but at least it's the middle, so that is where you want to be anyway. In fact, it all really boils down to how you deal with the middle, but we'll get to that. It is a fairly easy map to play for the survivors at the beginning, and perhaps even at the end of the match. At the beginning, the gens are easy to find. The survivors need to be a little bit wary that if they do all the gens on one side, they will find trouble on the other. But as long as they keep up with that a little bit, or if they get very lucky with spawns, it can be fine. Most of the times as a killer, you'll spawn on one side with all the survivors being on the other. Though rarely you will spawn on one side or the middle with survivors on both sides immediately already, which makes things a lot harder if you don't have certain perks and get to work really, really quick. So if the survivors are a little bit smart, the early game can be fine. In the end game, we have very different scenarios if the two gates are on the same side or if they're on different sides. If they're on different sides, the killer will have an impossibly difficult time defending them both, and endgame becomes really hard. If they're on the same side, survivors might be in real trouble, and opening gates against certain killers in endgame can be super, super difficult. So again, high variability here. And now again, we return to the center. What happens on the center? The center is a very narrow area that in some variations can be easily controlled, and in most variations at least can be easily patrolled. And what the killer will be looking to do is to secure either create a situation where you can split the team up and it's very difficult for them to get that person out of basement or something like that, or have a 3-gen on one side and play very aggressively and try to split them up regardless. And this can be brutally effective when it works for the killer. Though it's difficult, you don't always have the luxury of ending in this situations. You have to create them, which is easier said than done. And it's also horribly difficult to do as a killer the moment that the gens that are left are across the map. If you have 2 gens on one side and 2 gens on the other, you've already failed. You need to start really thinking of a plan B. It's going to be impossible to hold them because they're just so far, and the map itself is so big, and there's so much to go through in the middle. So massively strategical map that will often benefit whichever side does the more thinking. It's a fan favorite of tournaments, and in this map, even really strong survivors can lose to strong killer players if they use the right tactics. And you need to also understand that this map has quite a bit of a propensity to create dead zones. You can have generators on either side that are in the middle of nowhere and pretty close to other generators too. The main building in particular seems especially nasty in this regard, where 3 gens on main gen or on main building are common. And I've even seen some rare but totally possible 4 gens where you have 4 generators around the main building, which any killer with a brain would defend and easily win with. So the potential there is very, very high for killer, but equally scary if the middle happens to be a little bit too strong. The edges have a couple filler pallets that you can't quite deal with, and the chases take you all over the map, which is something that you definitely don't want to do. Either way, you'll have to use your brains when you go to this map. Good luck with it. Coming up is the Rancid Abattoir, which in my opinion is a bit of a bridge between Thompson House, which is the more pleasant of the farm maps, and the worst farm maps that we are yet to talk about, which can get very ridiculous. This map can be a little bit of one and a little bit of the other. It can be your devil or your ankle, and there's no way of telling which one it will be. Has a bit of RNG, and we're going to cover exactly why. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is the main building, which is the abattoir itself. It can switch directions, and this is pretty critical because even though this building doesn't have any insane pallets or anything like that, it only has 1 pallet and a couple windows. The way these windows line up with other stuff around the middle of the map can be pretty good. And the orientation of the building can also make it easier for the gen to be checked from afar. So the gen inside and the building itself will often be part of your strategy as survivor or killer in conjunction with the rest of the map. Now, notice if you look at the diagram that on either side of the map, on both sides, opposite sides, we have a battery of tiles together, which are perfectly symmetrical. Now, in the middle of this battery, we have either a harvester or a cow tree. And the way it's set up, you always get one harvester and either another harvester or a cow tree on the other side. So ideally for killer, you get two harvesters, which are weaker. Ideally for survivors, you get one cow tree on one of the two sides, which is much, much better. We'll see why in a minute. So whether you're looking at the one on the right or the one on the left, it doesn't matter. When you look at the harvester or the cow tree, on the right side, you'll have a weaker tile, which is either going to be guaranteed a pallet gem or a TL, not so strong. And on the left, on both sides, on the left, you have a chance to have a jungle gem. And that's it. It can be jungle gem on the left and weaker tile on the right. And then if we go back a little bit into the other side of the map, we have a shack, which can sometimes have decent filler stuff around it. So this shack can be quite fearsome and quite strong. Also covered by corn and sometimes hails around it. And in a single isolated tile. Now, this is very critical. If one of the jungle gyms that should spawn next to the harvester or cow trees are not there, if one of them doesn't have a jungle gym, it will be here. This map always has two jungle gyms. So either both jungle gyms are next to cow tree and harvester, or harvester and harvester, or one of them is right here. Either way, you have two guaranteed jungle gyms, which is decent safety, and that at least eliminates some of the RNG, and the rest will be TLs, pallet gyms, and that's it. Very, very simple stuff. So why is there really that much variation? Well, the devil is in the details. The problem with this map is that these tiles are very close together. And depending on the orientation that they spawn and the particular configuration, you can get insane things, particularly on the side that gets a cow tree, which can be either of them. So if you get a jungle gym into a cow tree, into maybe a TL wall that connects loosely with a filler that is right next to the shack, which itself maybe is next to an open to a gate that's about to be open, that is brutal for the killer. That is absolutely brutal. So it is very, very important that you remember the rules that I've laid out, or check out AMGC's rule sets, which explains all of this in detail, link in the description, to understand how the map works so that you can identify on the fly which gens you're going to try to fight for. Once, as a killer, you identify 3 gens, you'll often find that they are not too far together, that the map itself is not too big, despite the corn, and that it's fairly simple to play. It is simple to play for the survivors too, though. They'll find the gens really quickly, they'll coordinate very effectively, they're not going to waste a lot of time looking for stuff, so get to action, have a plan, understand which areas can be tricky. If you see something that seems ungodly strong for survivors, do your absolute best to play around it or play away from it, and you'll find this map to be serviceable for you as a killer and decent for you as a survivor most of the time. Next up, we find the Father Campbell's Chapel, a map that used to be a lot better for killer back in the day, but for some reasons that we'll get into is now a lot tougher. It's on the smaller side of things, so that's actually quite nice for killers. Killers that don't mind too much the strength of certain loops will probably find this map pretty comfy. But there are some other issues. Let's do a little tour around it. Beginning at the north of it, we have the circus. It's an area with certain almost guaranteed spots that you can find totems in, 4 pallet spawns that will typically spawn 1 to 2 pallets, and a little carriage with no horse, unfortunately, and a window that can delay the killer a little bit. This is not an area that typically connects extremely well with other stuff, typically, and it's mostly a place where you as a survivor might bring the killer into to waste his time and bring him away from other objectives elsewhere in the map. Likewise, you as a killer don't want to waste too much time here unless you are actively defending a 3-gen around it, which sometimes can definitely be the case. If we move a little bit more towards the middle of the map, we'll find a variety of maze styles, which are always consistent in the way they spawn, and the titular main building, the chapel. Now, from the outside, we have 3 pallet spawns, and there can be 1 or 0 pallets, depending on the RNG you get on the outside. None of them are particularly strong or game-changing. If we find one of the ways into our building, we'll see that it has 2 floors. The second floor, not very impactful. There are some different configurations that we'll talk about in a minute. But the second floor, you don't really have to worry about too much. It's not particularly strong. The bottom floor is the one that you really care so much about. And even though it might look very chaotic and very RNG, because there's a bunch of different windows, walls, and things that can spawn or not spawn, there's actually a fixed method to understanding which chapel you get. There are actually 3 different distinct chapels that are the same every time, and you actually have a way to identify which one you have. I'll tell you already, all of them are pretty good for survivors, but the third one in particular is very, very strong for survivors. And we'll see what that looks like. So the trick to know which of the chapels you have is to go to the second floor and go to the spot where the gen normally spawns. And from here, there are 3 possible vaults, and whichever one of these vaults you get will dictate which of the variants you have. Let's begin on what we call the green variant, which is the one that happens when you get this window by the generator that leads outside. This is the better one for killer. If you have this window, you will also have this other window that appears on the half stairs, which is not too bad for survivors. But more concerningly for you, you will have the back window opposite from it at the back of the chapel. Now, this window is incredibly strong, but luckily for you, you have breakable walls on either side that can be broken, and then the window is a lot more manageable. So this one's not too bad for killer. Now, going back up, we have the second variant, what we're going to call the blue variant, which happens when you have the window near the stairs and not on the wall next to the gen. So that window will indicate that you're on the blue variant, which we call. And this one is very, very similar. Very similar stuff. You will also have the same window on the half stairs that we talked about earlier. There will also be a window on the back, but this one will already have broken breakable walls, so it's easier to deal with. You don't even have to break them. But there's now another window that is also pretty good on the side. And yeah, this window is quite strong, but after you break the breakable wall next to it, then it also becomes manageable. So this one's maybe a little bit better than the green one, but overall, not too bad. But then if we go back, there's actually a third variant, and this is the really, really scary one, the one that you really need to be worried about, and that is the one that we call the red variant, and it happens when you get the vault right there underneath the chandelier, or whatever you want to call it. If you get this vault as a killer, that's bad news. The half stair vault that is normally there will be gone. It will be a hole, which is good. And on the other side, you'll have nothing, which is also good. But then to make up for it, you will actually have 2 windows on the sides of the back. And one of them on the left is not too big of a deal. This window is simply, you just play around it on the right or break the wall and it's completely fine. But then the one on the right, which can have basement next to it, is awful. This window is really strong and there's no obvious way to play around it, at least not effectively. And worse yet, this window can sometimes line up with other tiles because the main building rotates. So yeah, this window might be your worst enemy and it's something that we're going to remember from now on. Anyway, going away from main building, away from circus, we find the shack, which again, never changes direction, never changes spot, it's always there. That's about it. This shack, as you can see, is connected to a maze tile, and the maze tiles in this map have a really funny rule, okay? And it's a bit hard to, to understand why they did it, but it's very easy to understand how it works. So, if you look at the diagram that you'll see on screen, the tile, the maze tile that is closest to the shack, and the one that is furthest from the shack, both of those will be the stronger type. They will either be a jungle gym or a 4-lane wall. Now, typically, you'll get one of each. You'll get a jungle gym and a 4-lane wall. Sometimes you can get 2 4-lane walls. Sometimes you can get 2 jungle gyms. And that is a bit of a problem because jungle gyms are much stronger than the 4-lane walls. And as you can tell, one of them is literally right next to the shack. There is nothing preventing the shack from spawning in a certain orientation that lines up perfectly with the jungle gym. So if you're very unlucky, you can get an insane setup here, with fillers around too, but we'll get to that. So the furthest and closest tiles are guaranteed to be either 4 lanes or jungle gyms, one or the other. Cool. Then we have an isolated tile, we could call it, between the main building and the circus. And this one will always be either a pallet gym or a TL wall. And these are not so strong, so that's a really good thing. Hopefully it doesn't connect too well with main building, which it can sometimes. And then on the opposite side from it, we have two other tiles that are next to main building, which are connected diagonally. And this is kind of funny, because these tiles will be either a pallet gym, which is, you know, the one with just a pallet, or the TL. But they will never be the same. They will never, ever be the same. So that means that if you see one of them and you see that it's a TL, that means the other one is a pallet gym. And if you see that it's a pallet gym, it means that the other one is a TL. So by this rule, there will always be at least one TL in this map and at least one pallet gym in this map, in one of these two and the previous one. So that's it for the tiles. Now, let's try to put everything together. We have a smaller map that has some not so safe tiles guaranteed to spawn. Sometimes 2 4 lanes, which are not very good. Sometimes 2 jungle gyms, but I mean, that's less than other maps. So this map should be pretty good for killer, at least in theory. The basement can be easy to hold hostage in the center sometimes. There's decent gen log potential. You can have 3 gens on many of the sides. The gen spread is nowhere near as high as other maps. So this seems like a really, you can also use the elevation from the main building to quickly scan the areas and so on. So this should be a map that should be very reasonable for killer. And for some time, I believe it was. The thing that has changed recently, or more recently, with the rework of this family of maps is the filler palettes. The filler palettes on these maps are insanely good and have a lot of potential to waste your time. They are these little burnt houses with a pallet on the side, which are basically they're basically like a little pallet gym by itself. And there can be so many of them. If you notice, in the pallet count, they can swing from 9, which is little, to 15, which is a lot. Now, granted, some of these pallets are the ones by main building and so on, which are not so good. But nobody wants to have a shack next to a jungle gym, next to a mini pallet gym, which connects to an actual pallet gym. That is insane. And this map can do that. On top of that, the fact that some of these tiles are close to main building and the main building can spawn all of these windows that we talked about means that some of the killers that are less sophisticated in terms of chasing have absolutely no way to keep up. So this is a map that is on average pretty good with the fillers spawning in between all of this stuff. Few dead zones. The only thing that might help you sometimes in the end game as a killer is the fact that the exit gates tend to spawn by the circus side and they can be close together, but it is very, very hard to hold. It is one of those maps that in theory should be easy for you, but all of these factors that I just explained make it really, really hard. And in my own statistics, it's actually one of my worst performing maps compared to others of its type. So it is a map that I respect, that I fear, and that I at least understand. And I hope that you got something out of it as well. Coming up next, we find the Blood Lodge from the Autohaven family of maps. A very large map that we're going to explore together. Much like other Autohaven maps, it has quite a few dead zones, so, you know, depending on the killer you play, if you're a bit lucky, it might not feel as large as it actually is. First off, let's explore the main building. This main building has 1 pallet around it on the outside consistently. Not a particularly incredible one, but it adds to the already decent pallet count of this map on average. This main building will also often have a gen right on the outside. The second floor itself is not particularly insane. It is a nice spot to set up a boon if you have a totem there, or to use balance landing to avoid the killer if you're chased off from the generator. And it also has a window and a breakable wall. Now, this window and breakable wall can switch places, but they both play pretty similar. The window normally is pretty good. After you break the breakable wall, it's not so good. Some killers will have to do it more than others. Pretty average stuff, very manageable main building. Going opposite direction, across the map, we will see the shack, which is not extremely connected to anything all the time, but can be. So this is a strong shack. Both of these places obviously also can have the basement. Near the shack side and also across the map, we find a collection of tiles, and more notably, 2 of the Autohaven vehicles. Like the other Autohaven maps, there's 2 of them. One of them will always be a truck, which is the weaker one. It's nice, but not really anything you loop the killer in for a extended period of time. And the other one will either be a crane, which is the not so strong one, especially after the pallet is gone, or the bus, which has a weaker variation, or the stronger variation with the window in the middle, and that's the one you really, really want to get as a survivor. So 1 bus or crane and 1 truck. And then, as we mentioned, a bunch of maze tiles spread around the map, on the corners mostly, and 2 of them near shack in a diagonal fashion. If you look at the diagram, you see it very clearly. Now, these 2 tiles that are next to shack have a rule where they cannot be repeated tiles. You will never have 2 jungle gyms here next to each other, which is, I guess, a good thing that they can't have that happen in this map. But other than that little one rule, almost anything else is free game. And anything else could happen. The other tiles are completely up to luck, and you could theoretically, it would be extremely rare, but theoretically you could get 5 jungle gyms or something like that, which would be insanely good for survivors. So this map can swing both ways quite hard. You could also get 5 of the weaker types that are really not so good for a killer, and I bet that has happened as well. So on average, wildly volatile map. At its worst, it will have about 11 pallets. At its best, it can have 16, which is pretty nutty. And the distribution of this obviously also matters. On top of that, you will also have a bunch of filler pallets spread around the middle, typically. Sometimes more densely, sometimes not so densely. There's not a lot of consistency of how strong the middle is. And this will affect different killers differently, to just put it simply. Some killers that don't mind the size of the map because they have mobility, like Nurse, are super happy here. The fact that it's an open map is great because it means that survivors will have a much harder time escaping you and using line of sight blockers. But this also hurts other killers. If you have a killer that doesn't have mobility, that actually has to walk around the whole length of the map, such as Myers, you will feel it. And the fact that there's no line of sight blockers for the most part means that it's much harder to set up ambushes and catch people off guard. Many times you'll catch someone for them to run away preemptively and be really hard to catch. So that could be really bad for you, especially if the middle is filled with pallets that you cannot play around with your power. That can be quite tough. But what is your one redeeming quality of this map? One of the sides is pretty barren and can sometimes spawn 3 gens as well. The shack side only has 1 tile. This tile could be a TL by itself or a 4-lane wall or something quite weak. Yeah, there's no reason that it wouldn't be. And if you're lucky, maybe the vehicle that's nearby will be the truck. There's a 1 in 2. So if you're lucky as a killer, you could get a half or a third of the map that has nothing, or almost nothing after you break 1 pallet, then nothing at all. So creating that kind of scenario can be advantageous. And the map openness can actually work against the survivors, because if you have someone in the basement in shack, and then you have some gens that you're defending nearby, and there's a hill near it, or you sit near it, and survivors are trying to come up with some kind of rescue plan, what can they possibly do that you don't see? If you somehow have something to defend, survivors will find themselves in really tough spots in terms of being able to do something undetected or slip past your defenses. So that is one of the strengths of this map. Obviously, the RNG will determine whether you get a very reasonable map that's a little bit large or an insane map that can be a bit tricky. I've also seen rare instances of the tiles next to the main building being connected by interconnecting filler pallets and tiles. And that can be really rough as well. There's a big difference. If you get good tiles here that connect each other, suddenly even corners of this map don't feel isolated anymore, and they can be very difficult. So big RNG on this map, and big factor of what killer and playstyle you're doing and how much you can get away with it. Next up is the Ironworks of Misery, a large Macmillan map that has quite a few line of sight blockers and tall landmarks. So because you don't always have line of sight, you could sometimes feel just how big this map is if you have to go around these things catching up to survivors. If you manage to stick to just one side of the map, you might actually not feel it being so big. So That's pretty good. There's also quite a few dead zones that you're likely not to explore if the gens there are already done, or if you don't have any gens there in the first place. So sometimes it does feel big, sometimes not so much. If we stick right in the middle, you'll see that all the features are easily identifiable from here. We have the main building, which changes side and sometimes holds a generator in one of several spots. We see in the distance a landmark water tower or log pile, and then on the other side, opposite from it, we'll also see a log pile in the distance. Between these log piles or water towers, we'll have a long path that is always straight here, which leads us to the shack. And this long path is significant because it can actually spawn very decent filler tiles, some of them the straight tiles, which can connect the shack to the other tiles, the other maze tiles that are near it. This shack can also be connected or near other stuff here in the middle, so it's a very decent shack for survivors to waste time in. And even a basement in it is not that good because it's so far potentially from the rest of the action. The tiles themselves, if you look at the diagram, are split into 3 clusters, 2 of them together next to the path we talked about, 2 of them diagonally connected on the corner of the map next to main building, and 1 of it by itself. There's not a lot of rules for these tiles, so they could spawn almost anything. There's only one rule, and that is the fact that the tiles that are close together, the 2 clusters that are close together, will never be the same type unless it's a TL. If it's not a TL, then it cannot be 2 jungle gyms or 2 pallet gyms. It can be 2 TLs, but that's it. So for the most part, there's no other rules that prevent anything crazy from happening. Much in the classic Macmillan fashion, you could have 3 jungle gyms, you could have 3 other equivalent tiles that are fairly good, you could have 3 falling walls which are nowhere near as good. So the variance is pretty immense, and that is one of the worst things about this map. It can go from 8 pallets to 17, which is pretty insane. We'll talk about this a bit more, but first let's talk about the main building. On the bottom floor, the main building's not super crazy, has a window that is relatively easily played around, also has guaranteed pallets on the outside that you'll find there pretty consistently. If the basement's not here, it will be in shack, and you might get some hooks in the middle, which are pretty convenient. The second floor is often a headache for killers. There are multiple boon totems, and one of them is almost guaranteed to spawn here. It's very likely that it will. So the boon totems on the second floor here affect all around the main building across floors, and they're very strong to set up because only one survivor needs to come up here, and that will force the killer to come up here themselves if they want to get rid of it. And if a survivor is caught here, the second floor is actually fairly safe. It has a variable window and breakable wall. They can spawn in one of 2 locations, but both of them for the most part play the same. The window is super strong, and the killer will eventually have to break the breakable wall if they're like a normal killer and they want to deal with it. They can also do this prematurely if they spawn up here. But yeah, either way, it's going to be a bit of a waste of time, at least once for the killer, which is really, really good for survivors. There's also a chest here more often than not. So, a main building, a bit of a headache. It's connected to other tiles, which can be decent. This Macmillan family of maps is also pretty prone to having hills. And as we all know, sometimes hills can do nothing, or they can be positioned in a way that gives an advantage to survivors, since they can use them from a certain direction and then jump back to safety. So lots of variability here. On a worst case scenario for killer, you can get up to 17 pallets, 5 decent tiles, decent fillers, massive interconnection between the path next to shack, the tiles next to shack, maybe some other fillers, maybe fillers right in the middle. Yeah, that can be tough. On the flip side, you can also have variations of this map that have a bunch of TLs, a bunch of double window tiles, the weaker type, not too many pallets, maybe only 8 or 9, and maybe survivors that don't use the main building too well. On one of the big landmarks, like the logs or the water tower, you will also find a pretty dead corner. This is a corner that spawns almost nothing. Sometimes it has generators with almost no safety or very little filler pallet safety near it. So you do have a few dead zones here and there on some of the corners, which can be abused by some killers. So take that as you will, and good luck going into the Ironworks. moving on, we arrive at the Red Forest's first map, the Temple of Purgation, the one that belongs to the Plague. We have the big temple itself that doesn't actually change direction, unlike many other main buildings in other maps. And we'll find two sets of ruins that are consistently placed. A smaller set of ruins on the back, which is not quite as strong and is not typically connected too much to other things, and a larger set of ruins in the front of the main building, which is often more connected to filler pallets that have, you know, different levels of safety in this map. If you look at the diagram, you'll also see that there are three mostly separate and individual maze tiles. There are absolutely no rules for what these maze tiles can be. So they could be 3 jungle gyms, they could be 3 pallet gyms. There's absolutely no rules other than, you know, some inside conditions as to what could spawn. So massive variability there. And now we get to talk about the temple a little bit. Going inside it, it actually has a second floor up top that you can go briefly. There's a boon totem spot here. Watch out if you're looking for a hex, it could be here. Other than using balanced landing, it's not a big part of it. The more important part is the main room itself. And even though it looks fairly static, this room is not extremely it's not as consistent as you might think. The windows and vaults that open up are a little bit different every time. And the gates leading out will actually open when the gen in the middle is done, when the gen in the main building is done. Now, this makes the building weaker. So in the late game, when everything opens up, this main building will be weaker. One thing that you need to know is that this map has a chance to spawn a pallet. And sometimes it's not easy to see it at the beginning as a killer or a survivor. The way to know if the pallet has spawned is to look at the wall right next to the stairs leading up. If the wall right next to the stairs leading up is closed, then that means that you're in a variation with a pallet. The pallet can be right next to it, and this one, it's not very good. Unless the killer fails to see it and you stun him with it, it's not particularly strong, very easy to play around. Or, much, much worse, the pallet can be on the back entrance of the temple. And this pallet is actually a fairly godlike pallet. It is a very good pallet. So if you get this one, good for you, survivors. Sorry, better luck next time, killer. So identify it quickly by looking at the wall, as I mentioned. That's it for the main. Nothing too crazy about it. Until we get to the bottom floor. The bottom floor has the aforementioned main generator that should always spawn here. Doing this generator will open the doors that we mentioned, and also the gates that are down here, the little fences. There are 3 pallets down here, always, always, always. One of them is literally the worst pallet in the game. It is awful, really bad, unplayable. And the other one is also pretty bad until you open the fence, and then you can use it as a filler pallet. Not too bad. The other one is only usable after you do the fence opening, and then it becomes really, really decent as well. A bit of a time waster, but do be careful because this basement of the main building can be a bit of a trap. Yes, there's one extra way to get in. It's that little hole that spawns. That hole is always there on the same spot, so you can always get down here from that hole. And in the back, you will have one guaranteed fixed position hook. Not too many. So if there's multiple downs here, the killer will probably have a hard time getting multiple, unless the basement is also here, which is a 50-50 chance of it being here or in the shack. Keep in mind that the main danger of being here is that there's only 2 ways out, and they both lead back to the main hall of the main building. So if the killer sits right there, very difficult to get out. Against some killers like Hack, it is tremendously easy to defend this and very difficult to get out. So it's a danger that you need to wade in as a survivor and consider using as a killer. So outside of main building and the tiles that we talked about, this map is heavily influenced by the gen spread being fairly large, which will force the killer to try to defend them the best they can. And what you get between the tiles. As we've said, the tiles can be anything from really strong to really terrible. And the interconnecting tiles between them can have decent pallets, no pallets at all, or very strong pallets. And there's not any guaranteed or rule that makes it consistent across the maps. As you'll see in the breakdown of pallets, we have an average from 11 to 17. Now keep in mind that there are always 3 pallets in the main that are not so good, at least. So out of those 11, you could get 3 or 4 really bad ones. So this could really be a map with like 8 pallets or less. So that's great. But if you get 17, that's a different story. Because if some of them are strong and easily recyclable and reusable because they're part of like jungle gyms, you are in a world of hurt. This is a map that ultimately will come down to survivors using the gen spread really well. And if the killer is competent, it will come down to what kind of resources they have and how well they use it. One thing that's worth mentioning, we have a shack that is for the most part isolated, but it's quite important to use well still. And between the shack and main building, you will also 100% find a hook on the side that seems to be fairly consistently placed here. And yeah, behind the edges of the main, of the bigger ruins and so on, we have some other fillers and positioning of some gens, but yeah, that's about it. Big RNG on the filler. The map can feel playable for killer and also a bit of a nightmare, both simultaneously, depending on which iteration you get. Next up, we find the Shattered Square. This is the latest map and arguably the one we understand the least and the one we've played on the least, and perhaps the one that will change the most since it's so recent. It's only been in the game for a couple months. But already it stands out by having some very large contrasts. So for one, it is a very, very large map. The edges are not straight up walls, so it can feel even larger than it is sometimes. You'll notice that we have a main building that is quite easy to pick apart. This main building will always have 1 pallet on the bottom floor that is fairly decent. Think of it like a shack pallet, if you will. There will always be a generator in the main with a window nearby that some survivors can use to a decent effect without being super, super strong. The basement has a chance to be here, or if not, in the shack. And around the main building, there's also some lockers and some time-wasting vaults that survivors can use a little bit. Nothing too crazy. Not too far from the main building, we'll find a consistent tree that always spawns there. And if we keep heading in that direction, we'll see either an elevated marketplace or an elevated gallows, like an execution place. And this will often spawn 2 or 1 pallets out of the 3 that it can. And then throughout the map, all around the map, we find a very a mismatched set of tiles and filler pallets and a shack and some buildings. Now, if you notice the buildings, which are marked distinctly in the diagram that you see on screen, you'll see that 2 of them are on the edges of the map and 1 of them is also close to a 3rd edge. This building switch positions and can be a number of things. One of them in particular is guaranteed to be a complete dead zone. It's going to be a building with nothing on it. And the other ones have a potential to be buildings with a single pallet or a single vault or a pallet that can sometimes not spawn. So you have one of them guaranteed to have nothing, and the other ones, it's going to be a bit of a toss of what you get. More often than not, you'll get 1 or 2 pallets or 1 vault. These buildings are nothing insane. They're nowhere near as strong as shack or main, but the fact that they are at the corners means that anytime survivors waste here on the killer side will be very costly. This is a large map. You cannot afford to be chasing 1 person on the edge of the map for 20 seconds because by the time you down them, hook them, and walk to the middle of the map, 5 gens are done. It is super brutal that you have some form of semi-consistent safety around these edges, on top of being connected to the aforementioned gallows and other connected tiles. One of them in a particular edge is not very far, as you will see, from one of the tiles that can spawn. The tiles in this map do have some kind of rule that prevent multiple of them from spawning in high numbers. You might have 2 jungle gyms, but you're not going to have 3 or 4 or 5. There are actually 5 maze tiles, so you'll have some kind of limit, which means that some of them will be okay, some of them will be not so strong, and it's a bit of luck what you get. It's also, did I say that there are, forgive me, did I say that there are 3 houses? There are 3 houses on the edges, and there's also a house in the middle, which again can be ruined and have nothing, or can have a pallet or a vault. So yeah, careful with that. Lots and lots of stuff. Between all of these tiles and stuff, there is plenty of connective tissue. There are a lot of filler pallets. Many of them are low, which some killers like Huntress or Trickster can deal with okay. because there's good line of sight. But there's also fewer lockers for killers like this, so do watch out. Some killers really appreciate the fact that this map is so open and all of the loops have so many gaps and holes because they can see and adapt better. But for some others, this means nothing, and the large gen spread, the large amount of fillers, the insane average pallet count for an outdoor map will definitely hurt. Now, the shack is a little bit peculiar in its shape, but it plays out much like anything else. If we just want to talk about the few strengths that killers have here, other than that it's a flat map with not a lot of hills or elevation, other than the obstacles are good for some killers, other than the main building is not particularly insane for survivors, some of the tiles in this map are a bit weaker than their counterparts in other maps. So jungle gyms, 4-lane walls, they have more holes, they have more counterplay than some of the other variations, or they are a little bit shorter. So you'll find that the actual looping in this map is a little bit more pleasant than in some of the other ones. The problem, of course, will come once you look up and then you see that the gens are really far away and you have no way of defending that and keeping the pressure up. When survivors split up on this map, it can be very brutal, and it's a pretty open map where they'll see each other, they'll see you coming, they'll quickly adapt. If they play smart, this map will be very brutal. It's up to you to take advantage of what little things it has and maybe get a bit lucky or smart and cunning with the RNG if you notice that one area is particularly weak, which can definitely happen. Tough map, good luck with it. It's time for the Grim Pantry, a behemoth of a map in more than one way. It is actually very large, and good teams will make use of this, making the killer feel every one of those inches. But let's try to do a little tour around it. First, we have the main building, the Grim Pantry itself, which will rotate. On the left of it, if we looked a little bit, we have the complementary cabin or small pantry. We'll get to it in a minute. Not too far from it, we see the only maze tile in the entire map. There's only one. This is something that this map has in common with the Pale Rose. It also has in common the fact that many things can spawn around the edges. Killer props can spawn around the edges. Survivor spawns can spawn around the edges. So you might not like this so much as certain killers like Plague or Trapper that have to pick up their power for the edge of the map, and it's very awkward. Or Nemesis, who can't defend his crates and so on. So this is very awkward. The hacks can also spawn on the edges, which is super annoying. It means you'll have to comb the entire map looking for it. So that is really disgusting. Not too far from this tile, on a bit of an elevation, we find the shack, and this one has decent chances to be interconnected to other things. So watch out. And very close to the shack, near the middle of the map, you will notice two rocks that always spawn here, two little consistent tiles. Now, because of some slightly flawed totem spawning mechanics, these rocks are nearly guaranteed to always spawn totems. Always. One on one side, the other on the other. And this is really weird. It's weird. If you run hexes as a killer, they're going to be found really quickly, potentially. And if you run boons as a survivor, you will have a not so good, but very easy to find and very consistent to encounter place to set up boons quickly if you need to. Keep going and we'll find the pier. The pier is the only element of this map that doesn't switch rotation, so it's always going to be facing the same way, and you'll find the top by the edge of the map. And there are three different piers. One of them that resembles a 4-lane wall, one of them that resembles the tippity top part, at least, a jungle gym, and one of them that resembles something close to a TL. And each of these has different configurations, right? So, for example, the 4-lane wall can spawn pallet here or there. The jungle gym one can spawn a pallet here and there. And some of them can spawn a pallet upstairs and some do not. The main takeaway that you should get from knowing this is that all variations with the right RNG can be very good for Survivor. They can also be fairly bad. So it's a bit of a toss. You could get a pallet in one spot that is relatively useless, or a pallet on that same variation next time on a spot that is actually really impactful and a massive detriment to the killer. So high RNG on the pier that adds to the already ridiculous RNG of the map. If you notice, it can swing from 10 to 16 pallets, which is a massive range. Now, let's break the buildings up a little bit more. You'll notice that in the middle, sometimes you get a cornfield of sorts, a swampy cornfield of sorts, or you get filler pallets. And having them in the middle is super helpful, and not having them is super detrimental. Having a hail or nothing at all can be super difficult for survivors. So sometimes the middle will be stacked with stuff, and sometimes, forgive me, and sometimes it will not. And there's no real way to know what you're going to get ahead of time until you check. The main building itself always has one window facing outside. It's not extremely safe because there's an open space next to it, but it is pretty good if you approach it from the right angle. If you get lucky as survivors, you might get the window facing a direction that is convenient for you to connect with other things, which would be ideal. The main building itself has 2 floors. The second floor, the bottom floor is a little bit confusing. Everything looks the same. Half the pallets, more or less, there will be 5 pallets overall. Half of them, 2 to 3, will spawn down here. And they're not extremely good, but they can be good time wasters. And there's also a staircase that leads up to the second floor. Now, it's very easy as a new player to not know where to find the staircase. As a killer, you might pick up a survivor and try to find the staircase to go up, or go to basement, which can also spawn here, and have no idea where it is. I'm going to help you out. The base of the stairs is always opposite of where the generator is. So if you know where the generator is, and it always spawns in the main building, then you go to the opposite side and you'll find the entrance to the basement there and the one leading upstairs. A hatch can also spawn here. So on the second floor, we'll have a generator on one side. Both sides are fairly symmetrical. We have 2 rooms on either side with a bunch of windows that are decent time wasters. One of these rooms will have a strong window, a really, really strong window that good survivors can make very, very good work of and use repeatedly over and over and over throughout the map against killers that cannot play around it so well. So this is a good time waster with a couple pallets as well on either side, typically. One on each side, I mean. So a very good time waster of a building. Ideally, as a killer, you want to spend as little time as possible here unless you get a lucky basement and you want to play around that. Now, moving on to the little cabin. The little cabin also has 2 pallets, one on the bottom and one up top. If a generator is inside it, then the walls themselves, much like in main building, will be locked and will only open when the gen is done or when all the gens are done. And if there's no generator inside it, then one of the gates at least will be open. So, pallet up, pallet down, and a window upstairs that lines up with the stairs, which means that this building has very much no variability and almost always has a little bit of safety to offer for survivors, which is pretty good. Also, if you get a gen up here, it's pretty safe to do it too. Not very far from this little cabin, we find the only maze tile, and there are absolutely no rules as to what this has to be. It could very well be a jungle gym type, which is really strong, or it could be a 4-lane or a pallet gym, which you can get rid of fairly quickly as a killer. So really, nothing too good. And maybe that is the real strength for this map as a killer. If you get lucky, you will remember all of these little facts that I told you. You will quickly identify what kind of map you got. You will see its strengths. Maybe you will notice the 3-gen on the pier side, and maybe you'll notice a 3-gen here on the maze style side, and you will take advantage of this to make the map very difficult against survivors. If they have bad RNG, they might have only 10 or so pallets. Half of them might be in the main building pretty much. So if you don't go there, you don't even have to deal with them. So that could be pretty good for a killer. But more often than not, it's not as easy as that, and it can be really strong for Survivor. The first thing that survivors do that will be strong is to be careful when they spawn. This map has no immediate way for the killer to find you, and the spawns are on the edges and very unpredictable. So if you begin to hide and let the killer go around a little bit, waste a bit of time, if you know that you can get away with it, obviously, that can be huge. You guys can begin to spread out and start to attack different gens at once, which sometimes spawn even on the edges of the map, and make it very difficult for the killer to have any pressure early on. The fact that you can get multiple gens somewhat consistently on an elevation is huge. You could have an elevated gen on the main building, an elevated gen on the cabin building, you could have an elevated gen on the pier, sometimes 2 elevated gens on the pier. This means that some killers have a lot of trouble keeping up with this, going up all these platforms, only for you to have balanced landing and then jump off and run off to safety. So that could be really, really insane. Against many killers like artists, this elevation can be super dreadful and difficult to deal with. And we haven't even talked about the connections. The middle can have some decent connecting tiles that you can use a little bit, some filler pallets and so on. But the real strength of this map comes with what happens around the shack. Around the shack, you might have filler log pallets and the pog log, the log with the vault next to it. Now, maybe if you're very, very lucky, this log could spawn really close to shack. And that means that you can use it very aggressively and very often. And it's a log that is very recyclable, can be reused multiple times, and it is quite annoying. If you get a little bit unlucky, maybe this log will spawn on a completely different corner where nothing ever happens. But even that can be a massive boon, because sometimes you as a killer will be chasing a survivor into what you think is a dead corner, being like, okay, I'm about to kill you finally now, and then try to deal with the rest. And then he finds this log on one of the complete random corners on a really large map, and then they can actually run you there for a while. Yeah, it's a tough map. And to top it off, if you find yourself in the end game, the exit gates sometimes are good. Most of the times can be really far and hard to see from a distance. It's really difficult to make a plan and follow it through until the end. Good luck with it, and try to take advantage of the few strengths. Definitely understand and study the main building as much as you can, and the cabin building and anything that is static, because that's the only thing that will be always there that you can always take a little bit of advantage of. Next up, we have the very unique and large Ormond from the Mount Ormond Resort. This map used to be one of the worst in the game. It was very, very large, same as it is now, but it had even more maze tiles than it does right now, and many of them were connected. Luckily, that is no longer the case. If you look at the diagram, you'll see that the maze tiles are pretty far apart from each other. There are 4 of them. We also have a shack in one of the corners. If you remember old times, it actually switched corners. And the main building itself, which is massive. It's a very big building with multiple floors. There are always 4 pallets in this building. 2 of them will be on the bottom floor between alternating spots, and you can quickly check them to see which ones you got. Some of them, especially the one by the suitcases, are much stronger than the others. So a little bit of RNG here. If we go to the second floor, we'll also find out that there are 2 pallets here. One of them is in a fixed location by a little edge, where after you break it, if you're cornered, the killer will have to just break it, and that's it. And then you'll have to drop. And the other one is on the outside corridor thingy. And it will alternate between 2 places. If it's in one, then it won't be in the other. Simple as that. Next to one of these spawns is a window that is always there. It can be a bit of a tricky window to utilize. Be careful. If the killer is smart, they might drop from the potential drop next to it and get you once you touch the floor. You will also notice that there is a window on one of the corners where the basement can spawn. If this window is open, it means that the basement is here. Use that as a survivor and as a killer especially, because the basement here in the middle is very easy to defend. So if you're playing against a cannibal, for example, someone that can defend basement, and you see this window up, that means that the basement is here. Stay away from it, try to go elsewhere. So looking a little bit more around the main building, you'll notice that there are some windows that appear on the second floor and some variation. In terms of gameplay, it's not super huge, but the second floor can offer boons and nice little ways to end or extend the chase. On the front of the main building, we have a pretty barren area that has a little bit of a ski loop that is very, very bad, one of the weaker pallets in the game. So that's pretty good. This is always guaranteed to be here in one way or another. So this is good for killer. And if we go to the back of the main building, we'll also find a landmark that always spawns here, which is this little rock that you can go around that doesn't offer a lot of safety. So these parts of the map are very palatable for killer. A bit of a space waster that doesn't have much safety. On one of the sides, as you will see, we have a small cabin that is slightly elevated. Not very difficult for the killer to play around. You don't even need to break anything. Survivors will get hit here all the time. They can only use it a little bit to extend the chase with certain perks. And on the rest of the side, a bunch of filler pallets leading up all the way to the shack, which is in the corner. If we go to the other side of the main building, we will find that it also has a little landmark, the snow machine, which always has 1 pallet in it, and some filler pallets of different intensity and quantity around it, leading all the way up to the opposite corner from shack. So, what do we have here? For survivors, a lot of good things. This map is absolutely massive. The survivor spawns are often really spread out. You might spawn away from your teammates or with your teammates so far away from the killer that if the killer doesn't immediately get to work or has strong perks early on, you can do gens before anything happens, which is crazy. The gens obviously are easy to find. There is an absurd, and I mean absurd amount of pallets. Sure, not all of them are always great, as we mentioned, but still a lot of them. I believe 15 to 18, which is insane for an outdoor large map. And you can always, use the filler pallets that are almost guaranteed to buy yourself decent amount of times. If you're lucky, the maze tiles can be quite good. There are 4 of them. Fairly spread apart, but 4 of them nevertheless. And they are always guaranteed to spawn one different type. You will not have repeats. You cannot have 4 jungle gyms, which would be amazing as a survivor, but you'll at least have one thing that is good. So this can swing a little bit both ways. You can have 1 decent one and 3 not so good ones, or you could have 4 really good ones. That makes sense in the context of where they are. The filler pallets in between are very inconsistent in terms of how well they line up, but there's quite a few of them, hence the high pallet count. So overall, easy to play map that is really, really large, where the killer needs to be really, really smart. All of this would make you think that this is a super, super survivor-sided map, but there are some redeeming qualities that make this a decent, sometimes decent map for killer. Number one is that many of the obstacles, other than some maze tiles, are pretty low, especially main building and some of the secondary landmarks. So if you're playing something like Plague or Slinger or so on, you can oftentimes make many of these filler pallets be completely ineffective, and survivors will get hit there anyway. This is also really good, obviously, for killers like Nurse that appreciate having line of sight and can even use the second floor to scout and keep a bird's eye view of the map a little bit, so to speak. The main itself, as we've explained, is quite recyclable. It's quite reusable. It has 4 pallets, some windows, 2 floors. It's annoying, but it's also predictable, and it's something that you can quickly identify as to what you get and whether or not you can afford it, and whether or not after you do it, you're in a good spot. If you get rid of a couple key elements in the main building, suddenly it can become very, very good for you. And the fact that the building itself has such huge walls all around, and it has hooks on the edges, makes it a great positioning tool. If you hook in basement, or if you hook next to main building, you can oftentimes just use the building to check left and right to see every single location where survivors could come. The building basically splits the map in a couple different paths, and in some situations where you have a person on the hook, a person on the ground, blah, 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 it is actually really hard for survivors to get through without giving up more health stats and possibly worsening the situation. So you do have that little bit going for you sometimes. Other than that, heals can spawn, fillers can move, unpredictable gen spreads sometimes can concentrate on some areas, but for the most part are pretty spread out. So you have you don't have an easy pattern to always follow in this map. You'll have to adapt a little bit and see if your killer has any kind of power that can make some of these pallets and structures not so good. Next up, we've got the Groaning Storehouse, which takes some of the bad habits from the other Macmillan maps and some of their inconsistencies and cranks it up to 11. It is a very large map that can only feel a little bit more average if you stick to certain sides, which is something that you'll probably be doing. You will not want to chase around the entire map as a killer, and hopefully not as a survivor either. But regardless, let's talk about it. We have a main building that can change in orientation. Inside it, we always find 1 pallet that is always there, a potential basement spawn. If it's not here, it will be in the shack, and also 2 windows that are guaranteed. One of them is actually fairly strong and can be used repeatedly, which is really scary against many killers. And the other one is on the opposite corner, and this one has a breakable wall next to it. When this breakable wall is broken, the window is not quite as good, but it's still a decent time waster. And the orientation of this main building will actually mean a lot. Around the entire map, if you look at the diagram, you'll see that we have 7 maze tiles, 7 wall structures, which is quite a lot. Luckily, they're not all concentrated in a single area. 3 of them are around the corners near the main building. And you'll also notice, if you look at the diagram, that there's like paths that connect these 3. So there are 3 that are connected by 2 little paths around main building. These pads can be completely empty, or they can have decent filler palettes like the straight type palettes, which are really good. And the tiles themselves have no rules pretty much. So right here in this part of the map, you could have a lot of safety or very little safety with no guarantee of either of them. Very unpredictable part of the map. If we go back to the middle of the map, now we see the main identifying feature of the Groaning Storehouse, and it's the fact that it has two little pockets, two little corners of the map that you can more or less identify as horns sticking out. On the right, we see the shack pocket, which is closest to the shack. And this one has two tiles back to back. Now, there is one rule that makes it so that these tiles cannot repeat. So they will never be a jungle gym and a jungle gym. Unless it's a TL, there can be two TLs here. Unless it's a TL, it will never be a repeat. So that's a little bit reassuring. Because at least you don't get Jungle Gym into Jungle Gym, but you could totally get Jungle Gym into TL or Jungle Gym into something else that's also fairly strong. So even though there are some rules, they don't really do much. This can still be really, really ridiculous having two tiles next to each other with potentially other fillers around here while still being pretty close to Shack. Moving on, we have the other pocket, the one that is on the left side of Shack, which is the one that has the water tower or the log pile, one of the two. This one also has two tiles, but they are separated by this landmark and they're not as easily connected. So the deal with these pockets is that they can be a bit of a double-edged sword. It's really hard for the killer to check them. It's really difficult for the survivors to escape them once you get caught there. It can go a bit of a back and forth. Overall, I would say this map is mostly good for survivors and mostly scary for killer. But it definitely can swing both ways. Let's talk about what can be good for the survivors. The first thing that survivors have is the element of surprise. The spawns on this map are unpredictable and hard to verify unless you have certain perks like Lethal Pursuer. So once you spawn, if you hide a little bit, the killer will have to go around the main building into one of the pockets, check behind Shack, check behind every rock, check behind every tree. They will have no guaranteed way to know that they're going towards all the survivors, unlike other smaller maps like Dead Dog Saloon, where you can get into a chase within seconds. So it can be really difficult for the killer to check one pocket and then find out that they're doing gens behind main building, or check behind main building and now the gens are being done in the pockets. This map is large, and you have no way to catch anyone off guard in many of these areas. So that is really scary. And of course, it goes without saying the gens are very spread out. You don't have multiple gens typically in one area consistently that you can just stick to and defend. You need to improvise a little bit depending on what you get. Survivors, as a result, have a very simple tactic. Do one gen in an area that has a couple nearby, and then try to leave a remaining 3 gen that is really split. One in a pocket, one in main, one behind main, and now the killer will have no chance whatsoever to defend them together. As we mentioned, the pallet count in this map is atrocious. It can go all the way from 8, which is the minimum, to 16, which is insane. And this can materialize in the form of very decent filler pallets. So you could have between the pads, between the shack and main, between every little space, basically, there's not a lot of dead zones. You could have anything. You could have filler pallets. You could have little tiles with the pallet here, sometimes next to each other, sometimes multiple of them near the middle, sometimes maybe next to a hill, which is convenient with a gen that can easily be accessed from one side but not the other, so survivors have a chance. So there are a lot of things that can happen here. And the shack can be next to stuff. Obviously the 2 tiles next to shack are connected to each other. The ones next to the main building by the pads can also be connected to other stuff. Like, there is potential, probably not all at once, but there is potential for this map to generate some really strong things around the edges and even close to the middle. Because if the main building is oriented a certain way, 2 of its windows now become a problem. One of them could be lined up with something else, which means that survivors can constantly do a gen and go to the window if they are ever in trouble. So yeah, that's tricky. On top of that, the exit gates oftentimes will be very spread out, and defending them in endgame will be tricky. So this is scary for killers, but it's not all darkness. Just the same way that you can get 16 pallets, you can also get very few of them. There are no rules as to what tiles can spawn, pretty much, other than the one we mentioned. So you could get something ridiculous like, I don't know. Yeah, you could get 6 4-lane walls. You could get 6 jungle gyms. It's insane. You could get really a lot of stuff, and much of it can be not good for survivors. There was also a bug some time ago that made certain pallets not be counted. or the game basically thought that there was a pallet that is not there. So in some bug variations, unless they've recently fixed it, this map and other Macmillan maps could spawn 7 pallets or less pallets than they're meant to. So that could be horrible. And main building, if it's well lined up to the center, could have a relatively easy basement to defend. And shack is also not too far from center, so a basement in shack can also be easy to get into. So against killers that can defend basement, such as hunters or cannibal, you want to be very, very careful with how you mess around that. As we've mentioned, you can get also no filler pallets in the pads. You can get very, very low quality ones. Or no ones whatsoever. And the pockets themselves, the little areas that are thin and narrow, they are, as we mentioned, a double-edged sword. Yes, if you have a gen there that you need to defend and then another one apart, it's super tough. But sometimes if you have a 3-gen around one of these pockets, defending it is super easy. If a survivor is trapped in it, you almost never have a good chance to make a lot of distance out of it. You will corral them pretty well, especially on the shack one. The other one has a bit of an obstacle, but you can corral people pretty well into them. If you hook them into the pocket, getting them out for teammates can be near impossible. So a killer can camp you from really far away and make a bit of a stand on a bottleneck that survivors can get through. And sometimes you can also ignore them altogether. If you notice that you have a 3-gen on the opposite side from shack, behind main building, you can focus there. And then, let them do the gens on the pockets or one of the pockets, and you just forget about them and focus elsewhere, and you might not even have to deal with any of the stuff that's there. So in some situations, these pockets can be used against the survivors, and that's what you'll be looking to do as a killer, because this is a tough map otherwise. Moving on, it's time to talk about Torment Creek. It has some of the more pleasant features of the other farm maps that we've already discussed, but starts to get a little bit ridiculous with the RNG and its size, which is something that will only get worse in the other farm maps that are yet to come. So, before we explore it a lot, let's just look at the diagram and look at this map. As you will see, we have a path in the middle. That is always a constant feature. Near this path, close to each other, we have 2 landmarks. This can be a harvester and another harvester, or a harvester and a cow tree. Goes without saying, for the killer, it's better if you get 2 harvesters, which are not that strong. For the survivors, it's much, much better if you get a cow tree, especially if it connects to other fillers and stuff around them. So that already has a little bit of variability. You might also notice that there's 2 sets of maze tiles, one on the right, one on the bottom left, and they work very similar to Thompson House. One on each individual pair of these 2, one of them will be a jungle gym, and the other one will be a guaranteed weaker tile, such as a pallet gym or a TL. That's it. So you will have 1 TL, 1 gym on one side, 1 TL or pallet and jungle gym on the other. So that will be pretty much it. So it's basically guaranteed 2 jungle gyms and 2 TLs or pallet gyms. So that is not bad at all for survivors, but it's also not insanely strong for a killer. The other things that do change, though, are the amount of fillers that you get, the amount of hills that you get, and how much the corn gets in your way. The shack is close to a structure that always spawns nearby that can have a pallet as well. The shack itself is pretty good. It is surrounded by a corn on the back, but it's often easy to access while you loop other stuff. Decent shack for survivors. And then when we reach the main building, we see some of the creeping problems of this map. It is a very large main building. It has 4 spots with pallets, and out of these 4, 3 will be occupied with pallets, and 1 at random will be empty. So you have 3 pallets, which are decently good, most of them, and 1 empty one, and then also a breakable wall next to a very strong window that remains pretty strong until you break the breakable wall, with also a chance to have the basement here. Now, let it be said, this is a good basement if you get it. Easy to defend, maybe part of a 3-gen, who knows? But other than that, this building is pretty good, pretty safe, and pretty consistent, and easy to access, and easy to run the killer around, which makes the already large map feel arguably even larger. Among the corn and so on, we do have some opportunities to find gens in the open, but more often than not, you will have some form of filler pallets, some of which can be pretty powerful. As a killer, what you want to hope for is more barren areas, maybe some 3-gen on either side, typically not around the middle, and hope that the pallet count goes on the lower side of 8. Unlike Thompson House, this map does have few pallets, but it does have strong windows, unlike Thompson House, and more potential for lineup. So you're just hoping that you don't get that and that maybe you get 2 harvesters. On the survivor side, though, you can get 2 strong jungle gyms, 2 maybe conveniently placed pallet gyms or TLs, maybe next to some fillers, maybe not too far from the cow tree that can spawn in one of the 2 spots. And then a decent main building, potentially a decent shack. It's a very easy map for survivors to play. They spawn, they see gens nearby in the distance. Your plan doesn't need to be extremely complex. If the killer wastes a bit of time and doesn't get to work, you have, for the most part, a very easy plan. And it will come down to what quality of the fillers you get around. For the most part, the map itself is not extremely intimidating in any one area. It's just the fact that it can be large and spread out and difficult to defend in one area consistently. That makes it difficult for killer. That's about it. Next up is the worst of the Auto Haven maps, Gas Heaven. This map is horrible, and the only reason I don't put it on the bottommost tier is because I think it would look ugly having so many down there. Otherwise, I would put it there. It is terrible, really, really bad in many, many ways. The first thing that you'll notice about this map, if you look around in the map or check out the diagram, it's that it's the only Auto Haven map with only 1 vehicle. And this 1 vehicle is always a broken truck. So this one map cannot spawn buses or cranes. But trust me, there is a reason why they don't let that happen, because this map already has a lot of things going for it. The main identifying feature other than this is the fact that this map has 2 very long walls of cars. Now, these car walls don't really have any gameplay associated to them. There's no windows or pallets associated to them. They are simply walls where survivors will run you around to delay the first time you catch up to them and waste your time around them while other gens are being done elsewhere. It's just a huge time waster that makes an already very large map feel even larger at times, especially for killers with no mobility, which will suffer here more often than not. Thankfully, the 4 maze tiles that are split up are only 4, and they're not too well connected for the most part. They're not directly kissing each other. As you can see, we have 1 on one corner, 1 on the other corner, and another 2 a little bit closer to the shack, which sits opposite from the main building. The shack itself is decently connected, sometimes by not so much, and there is a somewhat consistent layout between the shack and the main building itself. And now, let's talk about the good things for killer. Let's get them out of the way. There's just not too many. This is a pretty open map. There's no, other than the car walls, which you can often even see through, there's not a lot of things to hide from, especially if the killer is being territorial. So some killers like Nurse or Blight that benefit from immediately gathering information will appreciate it. It's also a pretty flat map for killers like Artist and so on, which some will appreciate, with very few hills and no elevated gens as far as I can envision. And there are also no rules for the maze tiles themselves. You could have, theoretically, it's difficult, but theoretically you could have 4 jungle gyms or 4 TLs. Obviously there are some other rules that make this a little bit less likely, but you could theoretically have very weak 4 maze tiles with maybe not so strong fillers in between. There are also some guaranteed or near guaranteed dead zones that don't spawn too much stuff, especially on either side of the main building, right and left. So these are areas where sometimes survivors will just run to them and die, which is good. And the basements, both of them are not too far from the middle, and the one in main building in particular can be a bit nasty. So basements in this map can benefit the killer a little bit, and it's something of a threat. But now, I also forgot to mention that there is a hook next to the big Gas Heaven sign that almost always spawns here. So that is always a source of stability that you can always count on, I believe, for the most part. So those are nice things for killer, but that's about it. Everything else goes downhill quickly. This map has a lot of pallets, and many of them can be found in the monstrous main building. You'll notice that the main building has a back door and a front door. If one of them will be open and the other one will be a breakable wall. and which one gets open and which one is a wall can flip, but it doesn't matter. Both configurations are good. One of them makes a strong window in the front, one of them makes a strong window in the back until you break the breakable wall on either side, and that's about it. You will notice that at the back, there is a pallet that can make it really, really difficult to catch a survivor if used correctly. So this pallet is very safe, and he's always here, as far as I know. Inside, you will also often find a pallet, and in the front, in one of several spots, you will also find another pallet. So that's already 3 pallets that we have, and there is another one inside the garage where we often find a gen. This gen, if you have communication from your team, working on the gen is very safe, because the killer cannot immediately check or threaten it unless they get really, really close. And at that point, you can start to run or get out early. And it also has a fairly consistent totem spawn near one of the corners, which is super, super strong, because this garage only opens when the generator gets done. If the generator isn't done, this totem here can provide benefit to everyone, and it will be very awkward for the killer to find it and kick it without wasting very precious time. So main building already is very troublesome. The back of main building is a bit barren, and sometimes hooks there can be a little bit difficult to defend, but for the most part, main building is really, really strong for survivors, and good survivors will waste so much of your time here. In the front of main building, in the middle of the map, RNG plays a bit of a part. In a good day for survivors, they will get plenty of car, tiles, and fillers that are easy to play, easy to maneuver, and most killers cannot immediately catch you quickly at. The gens also overall in this map are easy to find and fairly predictable. Then we have to talk about the tiles themselves. Yes, it's true, you could get 4 mace tiles that are weak, but there's nothing preventing you from having strong ones. You could get 3 jungle gyms and 1 4-lane wall, or 2 jungle gyms and 2 pallet gyms with good, decent filler pallets between them, with no obvious rhyme or reason as to where they spawn and how consistently they spawn. So you might very well find yourself in a situation as a killer where the one gen you've decided to defend is in suddenly a really tough spot, or the first chase that you take up is in a really tough spot. And it's really difficult to give up on that chase, because when you go for someone else, you'll have to go around the walls, you'll have to catch up, and then maybe they take you to main building, in which case you have to give up again. So really, really tough. The shack itself is decent, sometimes connected to other stuff, more or less directly, which is scary always. Nothing fixing it. It's always capable of rotating and being even mean. And sometimes the exit gates can also be distant, but in my experience, they can also be not too bad. So that's a little bit of an in-between one. Overall, disgusting map that has a lot of consistent safety, that has a lot of variable safety, but that for the most part can be exploited by the survivors. Even if you don't have a lot of safety, if you play tactically and communicate and run ahead of time and pre-run, hold forward, the killers will more often than not have a really hard time. This is one of those maps that when I play it, I know I'm way more likely, and my stats prove it, to lose than on the other auto havens and most of the maps in general. Remember though that there are some newer tiles. If you're not completely new to Dead by Daylight, you know what I'm talking about. There are some newer tiles on Auto Haven that are very weak. So if you're a little bit lucky, you could get one of those weaker tiles on a critical spot, maybe with a 3-gen around it, and that's maybe your one way to win in this map as a killer. And finally, we arrive at the Garden of Joy, a very ironic name for a map that many people absolutely despise. One fun fact, this is actually a really bad map for the Dredge, the killer that came with this map, because the middle has no lockers and is pretty much barren in every way imaginable. And another fun fact is that this map has a lot of red tint to it that makes scratch marks hard to notice for many people, and a bunch of red bushes that used to be big counters for many killers. These bushes that are everywhere made the killers like Cannibal or other killers get stuck on them when using their power, while survivors themselves could actually get really close and loop really tight around them. So this was absolutely broken, and it made this map very unplayable for many killers if survivors knew how to abuse this. But thank goodness this has been fixed, so it's not something we'll be worrying about too much. Near the middle of the map, we'll find a consistent landmark, which will be a big tree house or a stuck on the ground train, which looks really cool but doesn't have much safety around it. And then we'll see that there's a road that divides the map in 2 halves. The map half with the main building, which is always facing the same direction, and the other map half or third with the shack and a bunch of maze tiles that are linked together. Let's begin with the shack. This is one of the few shacks in the game that is fixed in orientation. It always faces the same way, and thank goodness, because otherwise it would connect even more to all the other stuff around it. You will notice that on this bottom side, we have the shack and then 2 maze tiles. And there are some gaps between them. They're not directly linked, but it doesn't matter because these gaps often can and will be filled with decent interconnecting pallets. And even if they're not, along the road, you typically have a lot of cars which have filler pallets themselves. You might have noticed that the pallet count of 15 to 19 is actually quite massive for a non-indoor map of this type. These maze tiles are pretty good, or can be pretty good on average. We'll talk about that in a minute. And if we keep going to the opposing corner, we'll see that one of the maze tiles connects directly with this funny little parking slot, which is extremely consistent. This is always here. It always has 1 pallet and 1 window. And even though it's not the most powerful tile in the world, against some killers is actually not that strong, it is a very strong place to connect to another tile, and it is connected to other stuff, and it's a great place to end the chase in and delay the end of the chase even longer against average killers. So this is a massive source of safety and delayer that this map has here always for no good reason, in my very modest opinion. Now, migrating to the other side, we see a single maze tile crossing the road. Lots of filler pallets can spawn here or not, very inconsistent in that regard, and a gazebo / greenhouse between that and the main building. This gazebo doesn't have any consistent features. Sometimes it can be a vault that is more or less good. Sometimes it can be a single pallet that is pretty decent. There's no rhyme or reason to it as far as I can tell. And now we arrive to the main building. We're going to ignore it for now. Let's keep going around it, and we'll find that on the opposite side, there's also a maze tile that is by itself a little bit dangerously close to the main building. And now let's talk about the main building. So the main building always has 1 pallet and 1 window that are troublesome, and they're very close to each other. This pallet that I'm referring to is really strong, and it's always going to be here, so you can always use it. Just do be careful because it's next to a potential basement spot, so that could be tricky. And the killer too can use the second floor hooks as a basement-like strategy. But other than that, this is a really good pallet. Sometimes you will also have a pallet inside that is not as safe. If this pallet is not inside, that means that you'll get an extra window in the back. And then there's the 1 window that you have to really worry about, which is the one next to the kitchen. This window is fairly safe. If you take it, the killer has to go around it. You can then connect it to the other pallet that we talked about, or if you're lucky, to the nearby tile that spawns. And I've seen some combinations of window into other window, which are absolutely disgusting. This is one of the worst parts of this map, and most killers will suffer here. So this already is one of the worst bits of it. The other side of the building is not all that remarkable. Let's get to the second floor. There are a couple things to do on the second floor. First, you'll notice that there's a breakable wall at the top of the stairs that no one will ever break because it makes 0 sense to break it. In fact, if anything, it makes it a little bit easier for survivors to tell that you're coming. And yeah, there's a few features here. There are some balconies that you can use as a killer to hook people there and keep them there, which can be effective because there's only 1 staircase going up and it can be easily defended in some instances. And some rooms and balconies in the back that are not extremely usable or used for anything in particular, the way this map works. There's also a window at the back that can be used as an escape route, and the killer will have to drop on the side to catch up. Not a huge deal, but it can lead back to the other window we talked about. And the main feature of the second floor is the generator that always spawns there with a hole next to it. It also has another escape window next to it. And basically, if you get pushed out, you need to take this window. And if the killer is really close and they follow you, more often than not, they will catch up. So there is a little bit of risk involved with this window. Overall, the main building is not as strong as the shack side, but it does have a bit of risk associated to it. So, looking at this map from a survivor point of view, why is it so good? Well, there are 4 maze tiles, and the rules of this map are so that you will get at least 2 of them that are fairly good. If you're lucky, all 4 of them will be good, and if you're extra lucky, all 4 of them will line up with the gazebo, with the parking lot, maybe a little bit with shack indirectly in some way, and worse yet with the main building, which would be disastrous. So the potential for disgusting things is always there. The pallets, even at their worst, are going to be 15. There are a lot of pallets. You play against a killer that can be delayed by pallets, pallets. They will absolutely hate this map. Even if they're not used very well, there's so many of them and so easily available around the main road that you'll never run out of them. And another thing I've noticed is that for the most part, the exit gates on this map seem to spawn in a way that almost always makes them distant. I've seen very few examples from other people or myself of exit gates that are really close. So exit gates, for the most part, are hard to defend on this map as a killer. The only thing you can hope for as a killer when you are sent to the Garden of Joy is that some of the barren areas manifest themselves. If you are a bit lucky, you might be defending gens in areas where there's not that many pallets. There's also no hills on this map, which is really good. They can never be used against you. There's only little indentations, little pits, if you will, which offer almost no safety, only a minor delay in some cases. And as we mentioned, you can play into basement in shack or basement in main building or the second floor, which is something that most survivors are not ready for if you can camp that effectively. But watch out for anti-camping perks. Also, considering that this map is pretty damn large, it is quite open in the middle, which means that the line of sights are not that big of a problem at the start. And even though it is a large map compared to other large maps, I find myself spotting my first survivor much earlier than in some other large maps. So your first chases might at least get going a little bit fast. One last thing that you might find solace in as a killer is the fact that this map is a bit strange. The tiles, the maze tiles by the main building and the ones across the road are different colors. They're different styles, if you will, and they play slightly different. Some of them are slightly different than their counterparts in other maps, which will make some survivors play them worse. And they will not have the predetermined path that they are used to taking in some of the Macmillan, Farm, Autohaven maps that they're used to. So that might be slightly in your favor. And some of them even seem to be missing some windows. Whether this is intentional or a bug, it doesn't matter. It benefits you right now. So keep that in mind. And look out for any chance to use your power in a creative way to chase survivors into corners and get downs. You need to be very fast. If you try to break pallets until they are out of them, the game will be over before you know it. Good luck. And now it's turn for the biggest map in the game, the Red Forest Mother's Dwelling. This is the Huntress map, and as I've mentioned, it is the biggest map in the game, and it's the kind of map where good teams can force you to come a long way, so you are going to feel it. It's not just it's not just big in numbers, it is big in gameplay and practice as well. On top of having the main building itself, the dwelling, we have a little smokehouse, which is a secondary building with some safety, and a shack on the opposite corner, which is always on the same spot. And if you look at the diagram and look around a little bit, you'll notice also that there are 6 maze tiles spread out on the map. 2 of them opposite of shack behind main building, 2 of them very close to the smokehouse, and another 2 connected to each other diagonally by themselves left of the shack. Let's try to piece this whole thing apart. Going to the main building, you'll see that there are 2 floors. The bottom floor is the most important one, the one that holds the most significance for gameplay. It could have a basement here that can be easy to defend and easy to get into, so watch out for both sides. And even though there are 4 variations of this main building, they basically boil down to 2 versions, basically. Either you have the windows in the front, which are not so strong but still playable, and the windows in the back, which are very strong, especially the one on the right. And this would be amazing. And then if you have these, you have 1 pallet somewhere around the edges of the map. Or you only get 1 window in the front, which again is not as good as the ones in the back. No windows in the back, which is bad, but then to make up for it, you get 3 pallets around main building, which can be decent filler pallets and not too bad. So either you get 3 pallets and 1 decent window, or 2 windows, one of them being very strong, and 1 pallet. That's how main building bottom works. The top is perfectly consistent. We have some lockers, a couple ways to get up from inside and outside. There's actually a vault that many people don't realize can be taken, and another vault on the inside. Now, both of these vaults are risky if the killer is right on top of you, because if you take the drop, you will be staggered if you don't have balanced landing, and the killer can drop to the side and sometimes catch up to you on both sides. So there is a little bit of mind gaming involved here. You might want to trick the killer into thinking you're going to vault or not, or the other way around. If we continue to explore the second floor, we'll find the generator that is always on the little balcony. which has a little bit of cheekiness to it. You can get into this balcony from other areas and drop down carefully without making noise with the rocks nearby. But yeah, survivors will do this generator often because it's very, very safe. I recommend to you as a killer that if you want to hold a 3-gen that is close to the main building, you try to fight for this gen. It is a gen that's hard to keep, but if you keep it, sometimes depending on the orientation of the main building, it can be part of a 3-gen. So do keep that in mind. Going to the smokehouse, which is the secondary building, there is always a vault downstairs, fairly safe, and a vault upstairs that is a little bit trickier to pull off, but can still be useful. Depending on how this main building rotates and connects to other stuff, this secondary building rotates, it can be decent. It's at least a decent time waster, and it has these maze tiles nearby. Moving on, we have the shack, which can sometimes be interconnected fairly tightly with other stuff, and the 2 tiles that we mentioned earlier on the left of it. Now, these 2 tiles have a rule, if I understand it correctly, where they cannot be the same thing. So you will not have 2 jungle gyms right next to each other here. But other than that, there are no rules. It's very much like the Macmillan maps. If you watch those, you could have 5 jungle gyms. 5 jungle gyms in the entire map, on the biggest map, which is super scary, or 5 trash pile gyms or equivalent stuff. So this is super, super scary to think as a killer just how bad this can get. But the real headache of this map, on top of this variability from the maze tiles themselves, is what happens with the fillers. This map can go 0 to 100 real fast with filler pallets, and which one you get is very much up to luck. Normally you'll get something in between. Sometimes it can be really, really bad. So sometimes this map can create dead zones between generators and tiles where there is nothing, literally nothing, and it's a death sentence for survivors to go there, and can be part of your strategy as a killer. Sometimes it can have little annoying pallets that, okay, it's like a little log, you go around it, you get rid of it. And sometimes you have these cut log wood piles, which are very, very safe, very, very good. And for the most part, they all spawn pallets, and they can spawn next to each other, next to each other, next to each other in a way that connects shack to a filler, to another filler, to one of the maze tiles, to the smokehouse, to the other maze tile, to the exit gate, to heaven. Like, it can go in really, really stupid ways. And this map, as I said, doesn't have a lot of rhyme or reason. Sometimes these fillers can be can be by themselves next to main building where they do nothing, or they can connect other things in extremely, extremely mean ways. So at the end of the day, this map comes down to the fact that survivors have a huge gen spread. If they do gens, it's really hard to get 3-gen. If they just do gens at the start and the killer doesn't have a good, solid grip on the match, they will lose by default. Smart killers might take advantage of the occasional dead zones, and smart survivors will understand how the main building works and will make shack, main building, and any good tiles they get worth their weight in gold. So yeah, one of the toughest maps and one of the ones that I'm most scared to go to. Maybe with that knowledge that I just provided, it is a little bit more palatable for you. Good luck. Next up is the Rotten Fields, a very large map that will often feel even larger because it is full of corn, and when you don't know where you're going, you always take more time to get there. As you can see by looking at the diagram, the orange part in the middle envelops the shack in every direction and has corn all over the place. It is a bit of a dead zone. There's no safety here, but it is really difficult for you to know where to go. On the other side, those survivors have a very easy time finding objectives in this map. This map is the most open and flat possible. You see gens from a very long distance. So survivors will often spawn on gens, multiple gens, or find them really quickly and rotate really quickly. You will find that your gens on this map get done much faster, even by very clueless survivors, than on an average or, God forbid, an indoor map. So be very, very mindful of that. As you might have noticed, this map has no main building. There is just a shack that is always in the middle. The basement is always there. It is consistently good and bad, I suppose, in that regard, because there's not a lot of connection tissue next to shack, but it's always there, so keep that in mind. And also, borrowing from other farms, we have the harvesters. Instead of having 2 spots that could have 1 or 2 harvesters, now you have 2 guaranteed harvesters. And the third one, there is a third one, has a guaranteed 1 singular cow tree. And this is bad. Unlike the other farm maps where you could get a cow tree. Now you are guaranteed to have a cow tree, which is a fairly strong place for survivors to be. And the only RNG goes to where this cow tree exactly will be in which of these 3 spots. You will also notice that there are 5 maze tiles in the map. 1 up, 1 down, 1 left, 1 right, and another one also a little bit on the right. And out of these 5, 3 of them will be jungle gyms, which are the stronger structures for survivors. So 3 guaranteed jungle gyms. Unlike other farm maps, you now have to deal with 3 of them. Granted, they are not always connected to good stuff. And in fact, almost all of them are connected in some way to the corn, which is a dead zone. But that also means that it's very easy to get into them. Now, the only rule here is that the 2 tiles that are a little bit closer on the right side in the diagram, those 2 will never be 2 jungle gyms next to each other. So out of those 2 tiles, one of them is guaranteed to be a pallet gym or a TL wall. And then randomly, one of the other ones will also be a pallet gym or a TL wall. So pallet gym and TL wall, pallet gym and TL wall, and 3 jungle gyms spread out. Not bad at all for survivors, especially when you consider that this map has quite the swing in terms of pallets. On a very good day, you could get only 8 pallets. 3 of them will be from the jungle gyms, 1 of them will be from Shack, and then 4 more around. Maybe 1 in Cowtree, and maybe 2 or 3 fillers elsewhere. That would be amazing for you as a killer. Buy the lottery tickets from your stand on that day if you get that. More often than not, though, it will be more than that, and you'll have plenty of fillers between uncomfortable places. Particularly, if you look at the north of the diagram, you'll see that there's 1 tile that can be close to a harvester, not too far from a cow tree, and have 2 tiles next to it that are not corn that can have either a hill or a particularly troublesome filler. So you can have little setups that are actually really, really good. And when you consider this, and add the fact that survivors get onto gens fast, and consider also the fact that anytime a survivor is being chased, they don't get chased around the middle of the map very often, other than Shack briefly. They get chased on the edges. That means that if you're at the north, on the topmost, chasing a survivor on a decently good structure, now you have the risk of every other gen, which is also spread out, to be repaired in the meantime. Even if you wrap up that chase really quickly, you simply do not have the ability to keep up with the other gens. And the gen spreads in this map are absolutely atrocious. Other than the hope of few pallets and the consistency of a basement in the middle, if you're lucky enough to get someone there with gens around, you could argue that some killers benefit from this style of map. Certain killers like Hillbilly that have excellent mobility can go up and down and appreciate the openness of the map to use their chainsaw. The map itself is mostly flat with no generators on platforms, so killers like Artist can benefit from that as well. And yeah, there are a few other silver linings, but for the most part, this is a map that is extremely easy for the survivors. That is the main takeaway, and quite challenging for a killer. No matter what you do, even if you play well, you're wasting time, and the shape of the map is working against you actively. So no pressure. Next up, and getting close to the bottom of the list for worst maps for killer, is the Disturbed Ward, the second of the Asylum maps. This one is an absolute monster. Survivors will learn some of its quirks and use it against you, but you as a killer at least have the solace of knowing that some parts of it are somewhat consistent, and if you learn how to play around them and identify them, you'll be at a much, much better spot. Now, on top of being large, this map is also very confusing. If you look at the diagram, you'll notice that sometimes there are elements that seem to repeat themselves. We have a cluster of single structure tiles repeated 3 times. We have a cluster of 2 tiles together repeated twice. We have a part of the map where the edges protrude into the map, and that happens twice. So all of this together, combined with the very confusing main building, often means that you just don't know where you are. Even if you know the map, you just don't know what part of it you're in, despite being a large outdoor map. So that is a weakness that is not inherent to any of the sides. It can happen to killer and survivor, and it's up to you to get really, really good at identifying this map, which I'll admit it's still hard to me, and play around this so that you know where you are and what to expect. So let's talk about it. Right off the bat, look at the diagram very carefully. You will see that there are 3 individual structure tiles that are spread out on the northern side, and then 2 that are in clusters of 2. Now, I'll give you some good news. The clusters are not necessarily as bad as they could be, because there is a rule to them. They will have, each of these clusters will have either a pallet gym or a TL, which is a little bit weaker, and then either a jungle gym or a 4-lane wall. Ideally, for killer, it's the 4-lane wall. And the other one will be exactly the same. So on one side, you can have pallet gym and jungle gym, and on the other side, you can have 4-lane into TL. So yeah, it's not as bad as it could be. The other single tiles, however, could be anything. They could all be jungle gyms, they could all be 4-lanes, they could all be TLs. There's no rule, and it's up to RNG. Looking at the exterior of the main building, which by the way doesn't rotate, even though it's a bit confusing, we can eventually find a glass garden on the outside of it. And next to this glass garden, we'll see the shack very consistently. So this is a way to try to find your north. This shack sometimes connects more or less with filler pallets, and it's pretty good being on the edge of the map. If we keep following along to the opposite side, we'll see the actual entrance of the main building itself. And on the front of the entrance, we have 3 elements that are always here. One of them is a little path that leads outside, which can sometimes have a pallet or not, and a generator often spawns here. The other one is a set of benches in a little park, which can also spawn a pallet or not. And the other one is a little greenhouse, which can also spawn a pallet or not. And funnily enough, you can actually hit through the walls of this greenhouse. And then around it, we have all the aforementioned maze tiles that we talked about. If we enter the main building, we'll see that there's quite a lot to unpack. There are always 2 windows that are fixed. One of them is in the glass garden room that we mentioned earlier, and it's pretty good. If you take this, it will more often than not delay the killer, but the killer can break a breakable wall on the side to make it a bit more manageable. The other one is on the other side, and this one is just a good window, and the counterplay to it is not as obvious. It has to do with baiting the survivor multiple times or using your power and hoping that they don't go upstairs. If they do go upstairs, you'll find that there's almost guaranteed to be actually guaranteed to be a generator on the 2nd floor in the very middle. Doing this generator is a little bit unsafe if you don't have a call out, because you might not understand exactly where the killer is coming from, but with some perks or information, then it can be really good. The top floor will consistently have 1 pallet, although it's a little bit hard to see sometimes where it spawns. It will have 1 pallet always. Meanwhile, the bottom floor, by the way, all the holes and stuff between the top and bottom floor are perfectly consistent. So you can actually use them consistently as a killer or survivor for leaning spots, for dropping spots with balanced landing, and some of them can be useful in chase even if you anticipate that someone is below you or you hear them. So keep that in mind. The holes are consistent. The rooms don't change much. In fact, they don't change at all as far as I can tell. But as I mentioned, the bottom will have 2 pallets, and this is a big deal. Some of these pallets can be good and some can be not so good. One of them in particular is on a spot that is really, really weak that you can simply walk around. So if you get this pallet as a survivor, tough luck. If you don't stun the killer, it's not going to work. The other 3 spots are all very decent, and some of them are really, really strong. So the 2 pallets that you get on this bottom floor will probably, at least one of them will be very, very strong, and they are perfectly consistent. So you will always find them here if a teammate hasn't used them. And that makes this main building pretty ridiculous. Decent windows, decent pallets, gens on the 2nd floor, sometimes even a 2nd gen in the glass room. Main building can also spawn basement, so that's something to watch out for. This basement can be a little bit nasty, but that's about it. What are the good things for the survivors in this map? Absolutely everything. The map is absolutely huge. The spawns are extremely cryptic. Unless you have Lethal Pursuer, the killer will literally have no idea where you are, because you can be close, far, and you will almost always be behind several walls. So if you have Distortion and you know that the killer has no Lethal Pursuer, you could hide as a team, and it would be extremely annoying for the killer to commit to any one direction. They could waste a ton of time before they know what is even happening and find themselves 2 gens into the game before they can do anything meaningful. The loops themselves, as we mentioned, can be strong. They can also be not so good, but for the most part, they can be very, very strong at their max strength. The fillers on this particular family of maps are insane. They have these burned buildings with often pallets that are easy to play, and most killers have to be at least a little bit delayed with, which can connect things like shack to other stuff. Really disgusting stuff. And on top of that, even if you don't feel super confident looping the killer anywhere, if you take the killer away from your teammates, the map itself is so large that the time they'll waste taking care of you, hooking you, and getting back will often be enough for many gens to begin popping. So It is really, really easy to play this as a survivor if you at least have some level of awareness of where your team is doing genres. As a solo player that is a bit lost, admittedly, this map can also be quite confusing. Now, are there any redeeming qualities for this map as a killer? A few. The main building has some predictability to it. If you notice the pallet spawning on the bad spot, you can play around it. Some of the windows and second floor openings can be used to catch survivors off guard or stalk people from afar or get a line of sight to understand what is going on. You will also notice that this map has a slight similar pocket to Groaning Storehouse, where some of the double gyms that are together are in a slightly narrow part of the map. And it's hard to escape these. If you have a survivor hook there or part of a 3-gen there, that can be a big part of your strategy. You can stick really close to that area, camp a survivor from a distance, defend things from a distance, and survivors have very limited options of how they can approach that. So that can be quite good. And at the end of the day, you can also have, if you're a bit lucky, some more or less barren sections without a lot of stuff where survivors, if they need to do gens, they are in a constant risk. One of the more consistent ones is the path in front of the main building, which has a gen that typically has 1 or 0 pallets around it, not a lot of safety. On top of that, the RNG on the pallets is not insanely bad. At the worst, you'll get about 12 pallets, which is still plenty for a map this big. But the quality of those pallets can be very, very different, as we've explained. If you get 4 jungle gyms, that is insane. But if you get 4 lane walls, no, some of those pallets are not that difficult to play around. You might not even need to break them. So it can be very, very different depending on RNG, and understanding how to tackle each side will help you a lot. For example, if you look at a double gym, and you see that the first one is a jungle gym, you know that you are on the left side of Shack. If you look at the map, you'll understand what I mean, because it has a certain rule set to it that you can check out more in the link in the description for the rule set. So take some time to understand this map, and you will play a little bit better in your next matches. Until you do that, and if you're a beginner, good luck, however. Tough map. Coming right up, we find the Badham Preschools 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 from the Springwood realm. Now, because there's 5 versions, you might be led to believe that these is 5 different maps and you have a better chance to go into them than another single map like Midwich, but it's not how it works. These maps are all considered 1 in terms of your chances to go there, and it just has 5 different forms. For the most part, these maps share more than not. They are a residential street with some gardens and a bunch of buildings. One of them is the shack, one of them is the main building, the school, and then the other 2 can be interchanged in their position. And they are the 2-story house and the basement house of pain that we call as a bit of a joke. And as I'll mention, they have some differences. The number 3 and number 5 versions are easily the more killer-sided ones. This one have the buildings spread out a little bit less into the map. They're a bit closer to each other. There's less space between them. And as a result, the killer has better chances to secure 3 gen opportunities and try to defend the gens that are often found in or around the buildings. So these are probably the better ones. The Badham number 1 version is probably the most average out of all of them. It's pretty much in the middle, and it's the one that we'll be breaking down in more detail later. And then we have the number 2, which has some dead zones in the middle, which sounds like a good thing for killer, but it's really not, because survivors don't get chased there for long. Instead, they take you to the buildings, and these dead zones make the buildings further and further and further apart from each other, making it almost impossible to reasonably defend them in any real sense of the word. Then we move on to the number 4, which is arguably the worst of them all. In the number 4, we have a very long-shaped Badham where we have shack on one end and the main school on the other. And this map is it's just so long. You can be so far away from the action that anytime you commit to one side, it is extremely difficult to keep up with the others. If you're at shack, you will lose main building. If you ever go to main building, you'll be delayed a lot and lose everything else. It is a very, very tough one. The shape of the map makes it even more brutal, and it's probably the worst for killer. Now, talking about the things that they all have in common. All of them, in some way or another, have a bunch of roads that go around the buildings. These roads spawn cars that have a bunch of pallets, typically 9 of them. There's also some gardens in between some of the buildings or next to them. And these gardens can also spawn filler pallets, a few of them, normally about 3 of them. Now, Focusing on the main building, the titular preschool. On the outsides, we find 3 pallets that always spawn there. One of them is a bush that is not super safe, is the pallet that you cannot really get much value out of unless you stun the killer. The other one is next to a car, and it's one of those pallets that is pretty fair for both sides. It's a nice time waster, but a killer will probably hit you here sooner or later. And then we go over to the other pallet that is also by a car. This is also right next to a white fence vault that is always here and can be used in conjunction to the building and other stuff to delay the killer a little bit. Again, another fair pallet. If we get into the main building, we find that it has a certain repeating pattern. There are 2 pallets here. One of them will always be up and one of them will always be on the bottom floor. On the up, we find 2 spots and it will be on one of them. So you check one of the spots, and if it's not there, then it will be on the other and the other way around. When we go to the bottom of the school, we find a similar pattern. There are 2 pallets that can spawn, and if it's one, it won't be on the other, and the other way around. This is a place where gens can spawn. There are several totem spawns, which are great for boons, and basement can also be nearby, so watch out for that. Somewhat easy to get into this place, not so easy to get out. In fact, if basement is not here, and you can make it not be here with a map offering and a basement offering, it's a really difficult place for survivors to be hooked. If you go down in this area, there's almost no way for the killer to hook you. There are no hooks inside the school other than basement if you don't have basement there. So the killer will often be forced to break one of the breakable walls to take you out, which is very inefficient because he does not want to do that, because otherwise it makes the map a bit more accessible for different sides. So this main building is horrible. It is really easy to delay even strong killers in it, and it's a huge time waste. Anytime you're here, you're wasting time elsewhere. Unless you really know what you're doing, it's a dangerous place to spend your time on as a killer. Moving on to one of the other buildings, we'll either have the 2-story house or the House of Pain. The 2-story house is the most straightforward of the 2. 1 second. Forgive me, important call. So as I mentioned, the double-story house is the simplest of the 2 buildings. The bottom floor is very straightforward. It doesn't have any pallets. It just has some lockers and 3 windows that will always be open with breakable walls on both sides. Now, these windows follow a certain pattern. You will have one of them on one side and 2 on the other half. Always. There are multiple configurations, but you're going to get 3 windows no matter what. And sometimes out of these 3 windows, most of the times, 2 of them can be used in a very simple fashion, which will make it very hard to catch a survivor here if you're a normal killer with no crazy mobility. For that reason, sometimes if a survivor seems competent here, you might want to break one of the breakable walls. That makes it easier to break these windows and end that completely. Now, the second floor is a little bit simpler. We have a window on the front and the back. The window on the front can be very easily accessed with a quick vault, so some perks like Balanced Landing or Lithe can be at play here. And a gen is also found on the second floor oftentimes with some other potential here for other props to spawn. There's also a hole and a pallet that has a little bit of counterplay. It's a little bit dangerous to play this since you don't see so well around it. So not the most insane building, but a pretty consistent time waster if you play it right and have perks for it. Moving on, we will reach the other building that can also swap places with this one in all the maps, which is the House of Pain. This is a bit of a garage with a small house and a big basement. Now, the thing you need to know is that if we go down the basement, you see that there's 2 sets of stairs going in and out, and there are 2 potential pallet spawns. One of these will always be taken by 1 pallet that will always be here. And in one of the corners of this basement, we'll also typically have a generator. This generator is very hard for the killer to hear from outside and very hard to patrol, so it's a great generator to get done when you know the killer is busy elsewhere. The amount of lockers means that head-on plays are possible, and the fact that there's often totems here means that you can also set up boons, and they affect multiple floors, so boons are very common here. When we go up top, we find 2 configurations of how this map can go. Either we get a window in the back and front, which are good because it means that you can take the window in the back when you run up the stairs, which is really strong, and then the front one is not so bad. Or you get a window on the side, which is not so strong, but you compensate that with another window that drops into the stairs, which are pretty good. So either way, you're going to have 2 windows in a combination of A or B, and both of them have redeeming qualities. So even at its worst, this is a good building where you'll waste tons of time for the killer. Maybe the killer will waste time by himself just checking. So that's really, really good. And now on top of all of that, we still have a shack. And these are some of the worst shack offenders of all the maps. These shacks can, across the entire Badham spectrum, can spawn really, really close to other stuff and can have a lot of fillers in the garden areas that typically surround them. These gardens, as we said, have about 3 pallets in total. And the roads are filled with other pallets for a ridiculous total of 17 pallets in some of the maps, which is really, really insane. So we have gens that are pretty spread out and in difficult locations. Insane pallet count. Filler pallets that are often really, really good, and in some insane cases that can totally happen, you can have 2 pallets on the same tile, which is crazy. The buildings being fairly consistent and skill-based, and boons being a part of almost all the buildings potentially. And we also have the whole basement in main or basement in shack, and then main becomes really hard to hook in. All of these things are awful for killer. All of these things are awful for killer. Not to mention that many killers struggle to use their powers around buildings. If you're playing Hillbilly, you're not going to use your mobility effectively or use your chainsaw to a great effect indoors. Even killers that are really strong like Spirit can be slowed down by some of these very safe pallets in the building. So this is a rough map for so many killers. And the only reason that these maps are not the absolute worst is, number one, you need a little bit of brain to play them. They're not as easy to play as some of the other maps we've talked about this far down. So that's nice. Good survivors will make them difficult. Average survivors will not make them too hard. And they also have a little bit, the faintest little bit of indoor map syndrome, where if survivors pay attention, they can figure out what's going on. Most of the buildings have gens in them, and if you look outside, you'll see that the blinking lights indicate if a gen is being repaired or if it's fully repaired already. So those things can help, but sometimes survivors don't pay enough attention to those things, and they go to a building looking for a gen and it's already completed. Or they look for a building, they don't see the gen right away, they go away, they don't realize that it was around the corner. So they often miss cues and don't always repair and find gens the most efficiently, which is good for you as a killer. There are also a few killers that actually appreciate having so many line of sight blockers on so many buildings because they can ambush. So if you play Ghostface, Pig, Wraith, all of these killers that thrive in ambush opportunities, you might find these maps a little bit more tolerable than some of the other more open classic style maps. So that is something that you have going for you. But other than that, yeah, good luck. And we are getting close to the end, now reaching the Fracture Cowshed, the final form of the Coldwind farm maps and the worst offender of them all. It is a terrible map for killer. Very good for survivor if the RNG is kind. It can be ridiculous. Many of my toughest games that have legitimately felt unwinnable have taken place in this map. My stats show that it's a hard map for killers, and the own stats that the developers put out also seem to back up this notion. And if you, depending on how you analyze the final map in the tier list, this could by most metrics be the worst map for killer, at least in terms of potential loops that you can get. Anyway, let's begin where this map is not that different from other maps. It is an outdoor map with many of the characteristics that we found in the previous farm maps. It has a little bit of corn near the middle. Near the middle, a little bit below it, you will find in the diagram that we have a orange colored area that has just corn and no safety. So this is pretty good for killers, especially the ones with high mobility that don't mind this empty space. And in the middle, we have a single farm landmark. Now, in other farm maps, we've always had 2 or 3, but in this one, we only get 1. So this will either be a harvester or a cow tree. It could be either of them. And needless to say, the cow tree is much stronger for survivors and has a lot more options to be mean when it's placed here. So if you get a cow tree, this already will make the map much stronger. If you get a harvester, the killer will have a little bit of a break. Moving around the map, we see on one side the huge main building, and on the opposite side, the shack, with 4 maze tiles more or less evenly divided across the map, if you look at the diagram. Now, following the same rule as other farm maps, these tiles are connected. The ones on the top left that are closer to each other will spawn 1 gym and one jungle gym, the stronger type, and 1 weaker type, like pallet gym or TL. and the other 2 will be the same. So in total, you will have 1 jungle gym in each of these 2 groups, and the other one will be a weaker one. So this is honestly nothing too insane. In fact, it's pretty good that you have a somewhat fixed RNG. So this alone doesn't explain why this map is so good. Shack is in a corner, which is not super convenient and a good time waster. And it's a decent shack, as we'll see in a second. But it also doesn't explain why this map is so good for survivors. So let's head over to the main building and try to begin to unravel this piece. The main building is very good for survivors. It often has a generator inside it. I think always has a generator inside it. It has 1 variable window that switches places that is a little bit safe, nothing crazy, and another window on the opposite side that is really good. It has breakable walls on either side that you can break to try to make it better, and this is typically a good idea if you have to be here, and the basement can also spawn here. Notice that both versions of this basement are on the edges of the map. And this is one of the few maps in the game where both basements can be in bad places for the killer. The killer would love it if the basement was easily accessible in the middle, but that's not the case for this map. So be very careful as a killer. You might be wasting a lot of time going to basement unless you have a solid plan around it. On top of this other window that we talked about, the main building has 2 guaranteed decently safe pallets at the front and at the back. And remember that the main building, like many other maps, can swap and rotate, so the direction that it faces is a little bit up to luck. These pallets are fairly decent, and against some killers they are quite strong, and the fact that they're always here on an already pretty strong building is a bit of a problem. As you will see with the pallet count in this map, things can become a little bit extreme, going from 8 pallets, which would be very manageable, to an astounding 16, which is already quite bad for a map this large. This is not the largest map in the game, but you will notice that most of its features and tiles and safety and objectives are spread out pretty much until up until the edges, which means that you might be forced as a killer to actually go from corner to corner several times, which is very difficult to do in a reasonable time. So survivors have all of the things we've mentioned, plus easy to find gens because they're easily available and easy to see in the corner for the most part. Easy to keep gen spread, since it's so far apart. The killer will have a hard time locking down 3 gens, which are really hard to lock down in this map, and potentially a lot of pallets. But is that really what makes this map the worst or one of the worst? No. What makes this map the worst is the little paths that you see between all of these elements that we described. If you have a look, you'll see that almost all of these things around the edges are connected by paths, and these paths are the thing that make this map nutty. These paths are very consistent, and they spawn these straight type tiles, that's how they're called in the files, which can spawn pallets. And these pallets can spawn in great numbers, and they can be connected to shack, they can be connected to the other side of shack. This itself can connect to a jungle gym, which will connect to another one on the other side. They are also next to the main building, and they can be on the other side of main building as well. You can get 1, you can get 2, you can get 3, you can get 4. I think theoretically you might be able to get 5. That's the most I've seen, and it might be possible to get 6. I'm not even sure if that's even mathematically possible to get 6. But the fact that it is a possibility is deeply concerning. Even if you already get only 3 or 4, these tiles are really awful. Most killers cannot play around them very well. They are huge time wasters, and they are extremely conveniently placed to line up with shack window, which can totally face direct in the correct direction. For them to link together. It can be linked with TLs, it can be linked with jungle gyms. It has a lot of potential to be extremely annoying, and you never really know what to expect. There's no rule that dictates that if they're on one side, they won't be on the other. So you could find one here, one there, and one on the next one as well. And it is very discouraging for normal type basic killers to keep up in chase in a map like this. It is one of the worst maps in the game to keep a sustained chase in. On top of that, we also have a little corner that doesn't have a lot of stuff, but a gen will often spawn here, which will put it even further from the rest. And it is not uncommon to have 1 or even 2 pallets on this corner. It is not guaranteed, but it is fairly common. So survivors can come here, do gens, and if you ever inconvenience them, they still have a little something to run you around. There is almost no place survivors can be in this map where they don't have ubiquitous safety all over. Even after dropping several pallets, They can still have a lot. And to top it all off, it's a big map with corn that killers don't always navigate with perfect purpose because you don't gather information nearly as fast. What can I say? What can I say? On the flip side, on a very, very, very good day, this map might be a bit more manageable. As we mentioned, sometimes for some insane reason, this map will only get 8 pallets. 2 of them in the main, 1 of them guaranteed to be in shack, 2 of them guaranteed to be in the 2 jungle gyms. So that means that there's very few filler pallets otherwise. So these straight tiles might be very sparsely populated. And sometimes the filler pallets that spawn around main building can be there and be really strong, and sometimes they can just be missing, or they can be very bad filler pallets or non-existent altogether. So the map can change very dramatically from the worst to the best case scenario, while on average still being really, really good for survivors. There's also a little bit of a trend where one of the corners that is not shack or main building will often have a strong pallet around it. And this can be close to one of the sides or on the opposite. And sometimes it's better if survivors have a little bit of spread pallets, and sometimes they all concentrate on one side. So you could find some rare areas where survivors run out of pallets. And if you can somehow abuse that as a killer, that might be the only redeeming quality about this map. And that's it. It's a really, really rough one. And the more you play it, the more you'll hate it. And fingers crossed for a rework down the line. And now we've made it to the bittersweet end of this list. Arguably the most survivor-sided map in the game, as confirmed by my experiences, my stats, where this map is like several percentages below almost anything else, and even the community stats, the devs themselves confirming recently that it's a really bad performing map for killer. It is the Eyrie of Crows. But there is a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel. Right as of the making of this video, right as of 2 minutes ago, while making this video, the devs have announced that they will be reworking this map and making it a little bit better. They have mentioned that they're going to make it a little bit more square and a little bit smaller, which will probably, if everything goes right, will end up in this map being a little bit more like Ormond in terms of the tactics that you can do around it. And definitely a little bit smaller than it is now. So that will be wonderful, and I expect this map to drop at least a few spots when that happens. But until then, this map is possibly the worst. And it's not the absolute worst in any one way. It's not like this map is the biggest or has the biggest amount of pallets or has the strongest loops in the game. It really is not any one of these factors that makes Eyrie so horrible, but rather the sum of little factors that can add up and that enable a lot of evil, downright evil activities from survivors who can easily use an offering, a single offering that will send you to this map. So on top of having insane boon placements that can affect multiple floors and make for very annoying boons that are fairly consistent, this is also a map where sabotage plays can be really effective, especially if you bring offerings, because you already know you're going to this map with your friends. Sabotaging can be really, really good after a few key hooks disappear with offerings. The map itself also has a naturally thick mist that allows survivors to see over it, but prevents most killers from seeing through it very well. And this can be further enhanced by offerings for mist. So if you know you're going here, you could use a mist offering to make it really, really difficult to see from a distance. And you could even use a basement deciding offering to send the basement to the shack where it's arguably less powerful, to make this map even stronger for your team. On top of this, naturally by itself, even with no offerings, this map is bad for a range of killers. The fact that it's bright and open means that stealth killers don't have the greatest time approaching. They are rarely catching people off guard with very limited exceptions. The fact that it has no real thick grass almost anywhere means that setup killers like Hag or, God forbid, Trapper will have a horrible time here. It's very hard to hide anything on the ground that is not in plain sight. And just the nature of many of the simple recurring loops in this map makes it so that normal basic type killers like Clown or Wraith will be delayed for a long time, almost anywhere, since this map has quite a high baseline of pallets. Now, let's do a little tour of it. Near one of the ends of the map, we'll find this arc that is close to the shack. The shack can have some filler tiles nearby, but it's not too close to anything too strong, which is good. It doesn't have a fixed location, so it could spin in a number of ways. And obviously, if the window is facing against some tile, that makes it all the more powerful for survivors to use. We will see that in the very middle of the map, close to shack, we have this arc and a bunch of other structures that are perfectly consistent. They never really change. There are 4 spots that can be occupied by 2 pallets, and these pallets will always spawn in groups of 2. So you'll have 2 pallets and they will be diagonally found across each other. So if you know where one is, you can find out the other and the other way around. So the middle always has a little bit of safety. Near the edges of the middle, we find 2 of the 4 maze tiles that this map has, which are obviously really, really good being close to the middle, especially if you get some of the stronger ones. And next to them, there's also a little graveyard next to each that can have some different levels of safety, typically a pallet. And then we reach the big main building. It's very, very tall, but we're going to go around it for now. Behind the main building, on the edges, if you look at the diagram, you'll see that we find the other 2 maze tiles. The fact that they are behind so much stuff really makes it hard for the killer to visually check, even if the maze tiles are facing him and he can actually see the gens. It's hard to get information quickly. You'll notice that on one of the maze tiles, you have a recurrent fountain that always spawns there that has no safety to it. So this is a bit of a dead zone, one of the few dead zones that you will find consistently in this map. And a bunch of filler pallets maybe stringed all around. Now, going to the main building, it is a bit complex, but fairly consistent. On the bottom floor, you will always find 2 windows opposite from each other, each with a breakable wall next to it. One of them in particular is quite strong and has no obvious way to go around it until you break the breakable wall. So you need to invest a little bit of time here as a killer, or this window can be a bit of a pain. A generator will almost always be found here in the main building. I believe always will be found here in the main building. So that's another source of consistency. Luckily for you, this generator can be checked from afar, and it's a little bit harder for survivors to do under your nose. And that's about it for the bottom floor. Not much more to it other than the fact that you can have basement here and it can be easy to defend, so watch out, survivors. Going to the second floor, there are actually multiple ways to go up there. You will find that there's 1 pallet that will always spawn here. Most of the times you want it as a survivor to spawn right close to the space above the window, because this is where it's easily accessible and most useful, where you can actually get to it quickly and delay a chase. It's not an incredible pallet that will last forever and can be recycled and reutilized, but it's a pallet that can save you in a pinch. If it's not here, however, you will find it on the opposite side, on the little balcony outside, and it's a little bit harder to see, and survivors would do well to check where the pallet is so that they can rule out if it's not there. Okay, means it's on the other place. So figure out where this is. This other pallet is also quite okay. Nothing crazy, nothing really crazy on the second floor that will delay the killer forever, but it's still a delay, and the killer will often be forced to come up here if they want to get rid of boons that are very conveniently placed here. Moving on, we still have another part of the second floor where survivors can waste the killer's time a little bit by forcing them into a dead end with a vault. But this dead end can be easily broken by a breakable wall, and there's not a lot of ways for survivors to play this right. So for the most part, this is also another minor time waster that, if no perks are in play, should result in the survivor getting hit soon after. So a bit of time waster on the main building, but not the end of the world. No. Now, why is this map so far down the list? From everything we've explained, you might not get the full idea, but the main takeaway that you should get from this map is that it's extremely easy to play. For the most part, the map itself is large, and it feels larger than it is actually in numbers because of how you have to go around main and so on and other structures. And the gen spread can be atrociously big. Not just that, but the spawns themselves can also be very cruel, with the killer spawning really far away from you. That's another thing I didn't mention. You could use an offering to spawn away from the killer and potentially do a generator before the killer literally physically can get to you. And this has happened before, if the killer has no perks like corrupt intervention to counter that. So this is a very mean map in almost every imaginable way. And it is very, very easy for the survivors to play it right, and very difficult for many killers to play it correctly. Consider also the fact that they can have up to 16 pallets, which is really disgusting. And again, the map itself, the tiles themselves are for the most part easy to identify, easy to play in, and the gates sometimes can be far apart as well. So it's a map that just it's just hard to play it. It's just really, really hard to play it, and the numbers seem to back it up. Now, if you're a killer, fret not, or fret only a little bit, because number one, the map will be changing in the future, and we'll cover that when we get there. But until then, there are some redeeming qualities to this map. Number one is that it has a really strange rule for the maze tiles. Now, the maze tiles have a rule that states that they cannot be repeated. So you cannot have 4 jungle gyms. Thank goodness. You may have 1, but that's it. Only 1 of each kind, with the only exception of 4-lane walls. Now, 4-lane walls are these 4 walls that are in parallel fashion. And they have 1 pallet that's not super strong and 1 window that's not always super strong. They're not that good. For some reason, for some insane reason, this map can spawn up to 4 of them. And sometimes you'll get 1 or 2. If the odds are on your side, you can get 4 of them, which would be ideal because they're really not that strong, right? So you could get 4 of those as a killer, which would be amazing. There is also another tile that is a little bit weak for survivors. It's one of the variant gyms, which is close to a jungle gym, but not quite. And for some reason, we believe it's a bug, it's missing one of its windows, which makes it considerably less powerful. And after the pallet is gone, then it's a complete failure of any kind of safety for survivors. So there are some tiles that you could get, if you're a bit lucky, that are not so good for survivors. The main building has a consistent gen, and sometimes consistent gens on the back as well. A little bit awkward to identify and manage, but if you somehow keep those gens unfinished, unrepaired, you can defend them into the endgame. And the endgame also can be a little bit in your favor, because even though this map is relatively large, sometimes the exit gates do tend to be close to each other, or at least have good line of sights between each other. So I've had some really gripping endgames here because the exit gates are not so easily done under your nose as the killer. You also have a few other things that can help you. On one of the sides of the main building that's facing the middle, you seem to have a guaranteed 1 hook that is always there, that will never fail you, which is a nice point of safety, knowing that any chase you wrap up around there will have at least 1 quick hook. The main building itself can be quite mean. You can put someone in basement and defend it quite effortlessly while you do other stuff, especially as some setup killers. And the top of the main building, especially if you don't have any offerings to remove hooks, or better yet, have an offering to increase the likelihood of hooks, you can have 1 or 2 hooks on the second floor. And that is huge. If they mess up going to the second floor, it's not always easy for survivors to come back. They take a hit. What can they do? If the pallet is gone or if the pallet is away, they can't just drop away and run. They're going to be staggered and get hit again. So with very lethal killers, or killers with save best for last, or killers in a good spot, or survivors that are injured, hooking on the second floor can be a deadly trap that survivors need to be aware of. It also goes without saying that half of this map is pretty open and bright, and some killers just love that. Some killers appreciate that. If you play nurse, you probably appreciate the fact that you can see through most of the otherwise tricky loops, which makes it a little bit easier for some killers. So if you're riding on that train, you will probably be okay with playing on this map. And hopefully after the changes, this map, and hell, all of the maps, are a little bit better for everyone. I hope that that's your takeaway. I hope that you don't think of this tier list as simply a bias take. I really want the maps to be better for everyone. And I hope that understanding them how they are now at least brings you a little bit of peace in what can be a very rage-inducing video game. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.